He was the richest duke in England. She was nobody, and he made her his everything. Entry 11, the Duke's Choice, period romance. Engine, a dismissed right arrow chosen. Narrator, the Duke's closest friend, male. Duration target, 180 minutes, words. Film seed, mood only. The Deceiver, 1931. Part 1, the season that changed everything. I have been called many things in my life. A loyal friend, a steady hand, a man of moderate fortune and immoderate discretion. I have been the keeper of secrets too heavy for drawing rooms, the witness to events that polished society would rather have buried beneath its gleaming floors. I have stood in candlelit ballrooms and watched duchesses smile like painted porcelain, while their hearts harbored the coldest calculations imaginable. I have attended dinners where the food was magnificent and the company was poison. I have sat in carriages beside men who had just ruined themselves, discussing the weather with perfect composure while the ruin was still warm. I have been present at weddings that everyone present knew were mistakes, at bankruptcies that everyone present pretended were surprises, at social events of every variety that served as the backdrop for private dramas of considerable magnitude. In short, I have spent the better part of 50 years among the highest echelons of English aristocracy, and I have learned one thing above all others. Society is very good at destroying what it cannot categorize. Not dramatically, not with cruelty of any deliberate or theatrical variety. The destruction is far more efficient than that and far more impersonal, and for precisely those reasons far more complete. It operates through indifference, the vast, polished, impenetrable indifference of a collective that has classified you as irrelevant and will not be troubled to revisit the classification. The machinery moves on. You are left behind the machinery, and the machinery, being what it is, does not notice. I am 72 years old as I write this. I have no children, but I have 3 godchildren and a great many young people who call me uncle in the honorary sense, which is sometimes the more reliable variety. I eat supper early, read until I am sleepy, and have long since made my peace with the fact that the era I am about to describe is more distant now than it was real then. But I was there. I was present for every evening, every cruel aside, every turning in the long road that brought them together. And as I am, at present, the last surviving person who witnessed all of it, I consider it an obligation to set it down accurately before accuracy becomes impossible. What follows is not my story. It belongs to James Southerly, 9th Duke of Harrowfield, and to Elspeth Morrow of Shropshire, who was called many things that season. A nobody, a provincial girl, a sweet thing, not quite the thing, out of her depth, presumptuous, and who was, in fact, the most sufficient person in any room she entered. But I begin with James, because without understanding what James was, you cannot understand what happened when he encountered someone who was simply real. You should know first what kind of man the Duke was. The richest Duke in England. That is what they called him, and it was not an exaggeration manufactured for drawing-room entertainment. The Harrowfield dukedom encompassed 7 estates across 3 counties, 3 working mines that the expanding industrial economy was rendering enormously profitable. A London townhouse at an address that made visiting diplomats revise their assumptions about English understatement, and more farmland than several of his contemporaries combined could boast. His income was the subject of calculation at card tables across London, embroidered by mammas with matrimonial ambitions, inflated yet further by the penny press, which had a commercial interest in making it sound extraordinary. In an age when money spoke louder than breeding and breeding spoke louder than God, James Aldrich Southerly was, by any honest measure, the most consequential man in any room he entered. He was also, I should be clear, genuinely frightening. Not in the way of merely wealthy men, that vague aura of importance that money confers even on dull specimens. No, James was frightening the way a storm over the Pennines is frightening, the way the deep water past the harbor mouth is frightening, with its perfect knowledge of its own depth and its complete indifference to the observer's opinion. There was something in his gray eyes, a quality of attention, cold and complete and entirely unwilling to pretend to be warmer than it was, that made even the most practiced flatterers stumble. He did not smile at things that were not amusing. He did not laugh at remarks that were not clever. He did not perform enjoyment at events that did not give it to him, which was most events, and this refusal to perform, so unusual in a world built almost entirely on performance, had the paradoxical effect of making his genuine attention, when it came, seem enormously valuable. Which was precisely what it was. I had known him since we were boys at school together. The scholarship boy from a respectable but modest family, billeted in the same house as the future Duke. I was 12, he was 12, and even then he had possessed that quality. That watchful, undeceived attention that saw exactly what was in front of it and could not be persuaded to see something more flattering. Teachers had found it unnerving. His schoolmates had found it unbearable. I had found it, for reasons I could never explain to anyone's satisfaction, deeply comforting. A man who will not pretend to find you brilliant when you are not is a man you can trust. A man whose genuine laugh, when you finally earn it, is worth a great deal precisely because it is not distributed casually. We had remained friends for nearly 30 years. Through his father's death, which came earlier than expected and laid 16 years of responsibility on a 25-year-old who had not quite finished being young. Through the inheritance of the title and all the machinery it carried. The estates, the mines, the legal structures, the hundreds of people whose livelihoods depended on the Duke making good decisions. Through my own modest career at the bar and my comfortable widowhood after Margaret died in '37, James and I dined together every Thursday that London and circumstance permitted. On those evenings, he was not the richest Duke in England. He was my oldest friend, and we argued about philosophy and history and the literary failings of the modern novel, and he said things he said to no one else, and I said things to him that required 30 years of friendship to be sayable. Which is why, when the season of 1843 opened its elaborate production, I could see clearly what the rest of London was either missing or choosing not to notice. James was tired. Not physically. He was constitutionally robust, rode every morning regardless of weather, ate moderately, slept reliably, treated illness as a personal affront to be overcome by will. He was 41 and looked not much older than 35. But he was tired in the way that powerful men get tired when they have spent too long being powerful in a world that does not quite match their power. Tired of the calculation, the constant reading of every room and every face and every agenda concealed beneath every gracious surface. Tired of people who wanted things from him. His money, his influence, his name on a list, his validation of a judgment they could not quite hold without it. He had watched every season come and go with the same parade of hopeful families, the same glittering events, the same unchanging mathematics of who wanted what from whom. He was not looking for a wife. He was not, as far as he was aware, looking for anything in particular. He was attending to his obligations, as he always attended to his obligations, with punctiliousness and without complaint, and with the interior experience of a man walking through a familiar landscape that had ceased, somewhere along the way, to contain anything that surprised him. I mention all of this because it matters. What happened that season was not the arrival of a romantic nature long suppressed, or a heart primed for feeling, or a man who had been waiting to be charmed. James had no romantic nature, as far as anyone, including James, was aware. He had had, during his 30s, a responsible relationship with the idea of eventually marrying, which had produced several carefully considered approaches to appropriate families that had not progressed to conclusions. He was not averse to marriage. He had simply never encountered a person whose specific company he found indispensable. What happened in 1843 was not the arrival of something he had been waiting for. It was the arrival of something he had not known to wait for, in a form he had not known to recognize. What happened was that someone showed him something real, and showing a man who has spent 16 years in a world of surfaces something genuinely real is not a small thing. It is, in fact, precisely the kind of thing that changes everything. I first heard about Miss Elspeth Morrow, the way one hears about most things in London society, obliquely, peripherally, in the margins of a conversation that was ostensibly about something else entirely. Information travels in London in the form of implications, in the deployment of certain words at certain volumes, in the assessing pause and the apparently casual aside. The direct statement is too exposing, too potentially wrong, too useful to one's conversational opponent. It was at Lady Ashworth's pre-season luncheon. James attended because Lady Ashworth was the widow of his father's oldest ally, and he felt the obligation keenly, as he felt all obligations. I attended because James had asked me to, and because Lady Ashworth set an excellent table. The Morrows came up in the way the recently arrived in London always come up, mentioned by someone with the slight edge of uncertainty that accompanies references to families whose precise social position has not yet been definitively established. "The Morrows of Shropshire," said Lady Pembroke, with the particular inflection that manages to be simultaneously polite and dismissive. "I believe Mr. Morrow had some connection with the Ashworths." "His father did," said Lady Ashworth, with the careful neutrality of a woman who has been navigating social minefields for 60 years. "A sound family. The elder Mr. Morrow was very well regarded. The son had some difficulties. The difficulties, I would learn over subsequent weeks through the channels by which one learns these things in London, had been primarily financial. Morrow Peer had been a self-made man of the mid-century type, a manufacturing fortune built in Shropshire, modest by the standards of the aristocracy but solid and honestly made, accompanied by the kind of local respectability that self-made men of genuine character can earn. He had been, by all accounts I gathered, a thoroughly decent man. His son had been less thoroughly anything, not villainous, which would almost have been easier to categorize, simply weak in the way that the sons of self-made men sometimes are, inheriting the product without the instinct that created it. Investments that sounded better than they were. Living that outpaced income, not extravagantly but persistently in the way of water finding cracks in stone. A series of small errors that compounded. And then, 3 years before our season, the death of the younger Morrow, a fever in February, the unremarkable kind, and the subsequent revelation that the family's finances were in considerably more disarray than anyone had realized. The family that survived was Mrs. Catherine Morrow, a kind woman I was to discover, with the particular kindness that survives difficulty rather than evaporating when difficulty arrives, and 2 daughters. The elder, Miss Arabella, had made her come out before the financial collapse and was now happily married to a respectable Midlands clergyman. The younger, Miss Elspeth Morrow, had been 17 when her father died. The plans for her come out had been shelved while the family understood what remained. A maternal aunt, a formidably sensible Shropshire woman, had died in the preceding year and left a small but carefully managed inheritance. Combined with a simplification of the household that Mrs. Morrow managed with quiet thoroughness, this produced, by spring 1843, circumstances sufficient for a modest London season. Miss Elspeth Morrow was now 21. She had spent the intervening years at home, managing the reduced household, reading extensively, playing cards with her mother and the neighboring families who remained friends through the difficulty, walking a great deal, thinking a great deal, and arriving at conclusions about the world that, being formed in real conditions rather than drawing rooms, were considerably more accurate than most. She was, in other words, not quite what the London season was equipped to assess. The season's machinery processed money and connections and the specific surface qualities those things produced. It was very good at this, fast, consistent, widely accepted as reliable. What it was not equipped to detect was the kind of character that does not announce itself. The intelligence that had developed outside the season's approved channels, the dignity that requires no external validation and therefore presents no obvious social marker, the kind of honesty that is simply the way a person operates rather than a quality they perform. The machinery looked at Elspeth Morrow, found nothing to process in the expected categories, and assigned her to the category it assigned to everything it could not process, the irrelevant. I heard her name mentioned and attached no particular significance to it. I had no reason to. She was one of dozens of girls who arrived every season hoping for something the season generally did not provide. I had no means of knowing in those first weeks that she was anything other than that. What I had instead was a moment. A small, specific, private moment that lodged itself in my memory without my quite understanding why, and to which I returned repeatedly in the months that followed as the best early evidence of what I had, without knowing it, been looking at. The Hardington Ball was one of the fixtures of the season, a vast, magnificent affair in a ballroom large enough to accommodate several hundred people without the event becoming suffocating. Lord Hardington was a man of ancient lineage and genuinely cheerful disposition who liked throwing parties in the straightforward way of a man who enjoys company and finds that company enjoys being fed well and given somewhere agreeable to dance. His wife had the gift, rarer than it sounds and not teachable, of making a very large gathering feel, somehow, not entirely impersonal. James hated it with the specific precision of a man who knows exactly what he hates and why. He attended with absolute punctiliousness, because Lord Hartington was a man of genuine worth, and the obligation was therefore real. We arrived at 9:30. The rooms were hot with the combined effort of many candles and many people in formal dress. The company was glittering in the way that results from a great deal of money applied to appearance. Every unmarried girl of good family in London had apparently decided that this was the evening to secure the Duke's attention, and the result was a series of increasingly determined maneuvers through which James was navigating with the expression of a man walking through a field very thoroughly sown with traps, all of which he can see perfectly, none of which he finds remotely interesting. I extracted him from a particularly persistent mama through techniques I have refined over 30 years, and we retreated to a position near the tall windows where the air was marginally better. "How long before we can leave without giving offense?" James asked, quietly enough for no one else to hear. "At least another 2 hours," I said. He accepted this with the stoicism of long practice. It was then that I noticed the girl in the corner. She was standing near the refreshment table, a sensible position for someone not entirely certain where else to stand. She was quite alone. She held a glass of lemonade she was not drinking, and wore an expression I recognized immediately. The expression of someone who has arrived at a party where everyone else appears to know a set of rules they have not been given, and who is working very hard to give no outward indication of this. She was dressed with a simplicity that was clearly the result of limited means rather than fashionable restraint. The distinction matters. Fashionable restraint announces itself, says I could have more but have chosen less. Genuine economy says nothing at all, or rather says the thing it is trying not to say, which makes it, ironically, more visible than the elaborate. Her gown was a pale blue, well-made but not this season's cut, maintained with the care that is itself a form of labor. Her hair was dark and dressed plainly. She wore very little jewelry, a thin chain at her throat and small pearl eardrops that had the quality of something treasured rather than merely decorative. But it was not these observations that caused her to stay in my memory. What stayed was a moment so brief I nearly missed it. Someone knocked into her, not with malice, simply the natural collision of a crowded room. A small quantity of lemonade splashed onto the sleeve of her gown. Not a great deal, not a catastrophe, but visible and wet, and the kind of small adversity that can ruin an evening for a young woman who is already navigating more difficulty than she is showing. I watched her look down at it, assess it, and then, in a fraction of a second so private that I doubt anyone else in the room noticed, her face did something quite unexpected. She did not look distressed. She looked, very briefly, slightly wry. The corner of her mouth turned up in what was very nearly a smile, the smile that acknowledges a minor absurdity and decides, without great drama, that it is, in fact, merely a minor absurdity and nothing more. Then she set the glass down with perfect composure and turned to find a cloth. I do not know precisely why this lodged in my memory with such tenacity. I had seen hundreds of girls at hundreds of balls, but there was something in that private, unsentimental, entirely unperformed little smile, that refusal to catastrophize, that quiet interior recognition of the comic in the uncomfortable, that decision to find something slightly funny and then simply address it, that I could not quite leave behind. I thought, whoever she is, she has good sense. And then the evening moved on, and I did not think of her again for 10 days. Until the following Tuesday, when everything changed. Part 2, the card party. Mrs. Galverton's card party was a smaller and considerably more pointed social event than the Hartington ball. I should describe Mrs. Galverton because she is important to the story, and because she is exactly the kind of person who sounds, when described, like a caricature, but who is in fact entirely real and entirely representative of a specific social type, produced by the drawing rooms of a certain class in every generation. She was a woman of fashion, which is to say she had made fashion a profession, and pursued it with the seriousness of purpose that other women directed toward less frivolous enterprises. She was approximately 55, widowed in excellent circumstances, and possessed of the combination, intelligence, social memory, willingness to deploy both without scruple that constituted genuine social power in mid-century London. She was not unintelligent. She was not without kindness in certain limited contexts. But her relationship to social power was fundamentally extractive, She valued it as a tool for maintaining her position, and she maintained her position primarily through the leverage of her disapproval. To have her approval was useful. To have her disapproval was actively damaging. This was widely understood and acted upon. She also possessed an extremely sharp intelligence regarding the social landscape, which is why I could not quite understand, in retrospect, why she made the mistake she made with Miss Morrow. It was not a stupid mistake, but it was the mistake of someone who has been assessing by the correct criteria for so long that she has forgotten to check whether the criteria themselves might occasionally fail. James attended because of the business connection with her late husband. I attended because I was curious, in the way one sometimes finds oneself curious about what the next significant moment is going to look like. 25 or 30 people in a room slightly smaller than was comfortable for the number, deliberate, I had always suspected. Close quarters, Mrs. Galverton had once told me, are marvelous for revealing character. She was right. Compressed situations strip the margin between a person's performed self and their actual self. I spotted Miss Morrow within moments. She was at one of the card tables, partnered with Colonel Forthby, a decent old man of limited conversational range but genuine cardroom experience, playing against two women I did not immediately recognize. I positioned myself where I could observe the table without appearing to do so. She was an excellent card player. Not merely capable, the difference was qualitative. She played with a concentrated attention unlike the approach of the other players, who were engaged in the social mode, managing conversation and relationship, and the actual game simultaneously, weighting each by some intuitive calculation. Miss Morrow appeared to be playing the game itself, which sounds simple but is not. Most players in social settings are playing something far more complex than the cards on the table. They are playing the social situation, using the game as a vehicle for the subtle exercise of social prerogative. To actually play the cards, to treat the social element as secondary to the intellectual problem, is rare. It produces a quality of economy and precision entirely different from the social card play surrounding it. Twice I watched her make a bid that produced visible surprise in Colonel Forthby, and that subsequently proved, by the outcome of the hand, to have been considerably shrewder than it appeared. She did not call attention to this. She simply played the next card. Mrs. Galverton had also been watching. She moved toward the table in that way she had, casual, smooth, inevitable as a tide, and positioned herself to observe the play. And then, in the lull following the conclusion of a hand, she said, in a voice pitched precisely to Carrie, "You play rather well for a provincial girl. Who taught you?" Masterful in its way. Complimentary on the surface, play rather well, and dismissive in the undertow, for a provincial girl. The combination was technically a compliment and functionally an assessment of limitation. The expected response was grateful pleasure at being noticed combined with bashful acknowledgement of her provincial deficiencies. I watched Miss Morrow's face. She looked up at Mrs. Galverton, not quickly, not startled, with the composure of someone who has processed the remark in the moment of hearing it and has arrived at a considered response. "My father taught me," she said. "He was an excellent player." Even, not cold, cold would have communicated things she did not intend. Simply even, the answer of someone who has been asked a question and has answered it accurately. "Indeed," Mrs. Galverton's smile widened slightly. "And is he here this evening?" "He died 3 years ago," said Miss Morrow, with the same natural composure, entirely free of performance. "I find the game a pleasant way to keep his company when I miss it." The silence that followed was the specific silence of a room that has heard something it did not expect. Not an uncomfortable silence, but an absorbed one. Mrs. Galverton had expected either flustered gratitude or wounded pride. She had received instead something she did not quite have a category for. A true answer, offered without self-pity, without any attempt to extract sympathy from it. That made the question, with its implication of provincial limitation, feel, in retrospect, slightly beside the point. She could not pursue the condescension without appearing to be unsympathetic to a girl whose father had recently died. The answer had simply, quietly, made the condescension cost more than it was worth. "I see," said Mrs. Galverton, and moved on to the next table. I watched Miss Morrow pick up her cards. She did not watch Mrs. Galverton's retreating back. She did not exchange a glance with Colonel Forthby. She simply picked up her cards, assessed them in that quiet, concentrated way, and prepared to play. And then I looked at James. He was standing some 12 feet away, near the fireplace. He had been looking in the direction of the card table. Whether he had heard the exchange as clearly as I had from my closer position, I could not be certain. But his expression had acquired, in the last few moments, something I recognized. I had seen it on specific occasions when something cut through the thick upholstery of social convention and made contact with what was underneath. It was not admiration, not yet, something more basic than admiration, something that precedes it. The expression of a man who has just noticed something he was not expecting to notice. He said nothing to me that evening. James seldom said things directly the first time. There was always a period of internal processing before the outward expression arrived. I had learned to read the interval, to distinguish the processing that would produce something from the processing that would not. On Thursday, over the port, he said, quite abruptly, "The Morrow girl. Do you know anything about her?" I told him what I knew. The family outline, the father's manufacturing business, the son's financial difficulties, the death, the reduced circumstances, the maternal aunt's inheritance, the delayed come-out, the modest season. I watched his face as I spoke. He listened with the concentrated quality he used when he intended to retain information accurately. "She plays cards well," he said when I finished. "Better than well. She plays as though she's genuinely thinking about the game." A pause, his glass turned once precisely on the table. "She answered Mrs. Galverton very correctly." "She did." The answer about her father, it was true, not calculated to produce sympathy. Simply true, he paused. In my experience, people seldom give the simply true answer when the simply true answer is also the potentially moving one. They either suppress it entirely or deploy it for effect. She did neither. "No," I said, "she did not." He was quiet for a moment longer. Then, "I should like to be introduced." I waited a moment to be certain I had heard correctly. In 30 years of friendship, James Southerly had never once expressed a wish to be specifically introduced to a particular young woman. He had been introduced to many. The mechanics of the season required it. But the expression of a specific desire directed at a specific person. "Never." "I shall arrange it," I said, with the composure of a man who has just received information of some consequence and has elected to say very little about it. Part 3, the watercolor and the introduction. The arrangement was made at Mrs. Thornfield's watercolor exhibition, a mid-season cultural event that served primarily as an excuse for social circulation, as most such events did. I had ascertained that Miss Morrow and her mother were expected to attend. I arrived early enough to greet them as they came in. Mrs. Morrow was a small, anxious woman who brightened considerably at finding a familiar face and relaxed, somewhat, from the particular tension of a woman who loves her daughter and is tracking, at every moment, the social landscape for signs of danger. Miss Morrow, at close range and in better light than previous occasions had offered, was rather more striking than my earlier glimpses had suggested. Not merely in appearance, though her features were good, and her bearing easy and natural rather than studied. It was a quality of presence, the specific animation of someone who is genuinely engaged rather than performing engagement. She was looking at the watercolors with what appeared to be actual interest, and her observations about them, offered quietly to her mother, suggested she had spent time thinking about the craft rather than simply about the social signification of cultural appreciation. "You have strong views about Constable," she said to me at one point, with a quality of very dry amusement that told me she had been listening to my opinions for several minutes and had formed an accurate picture of my relationship to the subject. "I have strong views about everything," I said. "It is one of the less admirable qualities of elderly men." "My father was the same," she said. "He had particularly strong views about the proper height of a bookshelf." A brief pause. "He considered anything under 6 feet a waste of architectural potential." I laughed genuinely, not as a social courtesy, because the remark was precisely observed and because the way she deployed it, locating the comic in something that was also sad, refusing to make the sadness the whole of what she was offering, was exactly right. And in that moment, James arrived. "Your Grace, may I present Mrs. Morrow and Miss Morrow of Shropshire. Miss Morrow, the Duke of Harrowfield." What followed was notable for its lack of notable quality. Miss Morrow did not dissolve into the species of flutter the Duke of Harrowfield generally produced in unmarried young women. She curtsied correctly, looked at him with the same attention she had been giving the paintings, and said, "Good afternoon, Your Grace." Not warmly, not coolly, correctly. James did not deploy the gracious but distant manner he generally employed with young women he was being introduced to for social obligation. He said, "Miss Morrow, I understand you play cards very well." A slight pause, clearly not the opening she had anticipated. "Reasonably well," she said. "I enjoy the problem-solving of it." "The problem-solving," James repeated, in the tone of a man examining something interesting. "Not the social aspect." "The social aspect of card play," she said with careful precision, "seems to me to be frequently at odds with the intellectual aspect. Most players appear to be playing each other rather than the cards themselves." "That is quite accurate," said James. "And which do you prefer to play?" "The cards themselves," she said. "People are considerably less predictable." James looked at her for a moment with an expression I could not entirely read. Something had shifted in it from the controlled surface he maintained socially. Then he said, "Would you like to look at the Cotman? It is the best thing in the room, and everyone is ignoring it because it's been hung in the corner." She paused, looked at him with mild surprise, and then said simply, "Yes, I would." They moved toward the Cotman, which was indeed excellent and was being ignored in favor of a mediocre Sandby in a more prominent position. This is a very old story, in art as in social life. I remained with Mrs. Morrow, who was watching her daughter's back with the expression of a woman experiencing hope and terror in such close proximity that they had become difficult to distinguish. "He seems very," she began, and could not find the word. "He is when he chooses to be," I said. "The complication is that he seldom chooses to be." She looked at me, and now, I said, watching James's back, "he appears to be choosing." They stood before the Cotman for considerably longer than the conventional appreciation of a watercolor requires. The conversation had about it, across the room from where I stood, the quality of something genuinely mutual rather than performed. Not the careful exchange of socially useful information, but two people actually talking about something they were both looking at. Mrs. Galverton arrived at 3:30, moving toward James with the purpose of a woman who has decided he has been unattended long enough. She arrived at his elbow with a perfectly timed interruption, registered Miss Morrow's presence with a flicker of social computation, and then said, in the aside that was not an aside, pitched just loudly enough that she was sure Miss Morrow found the company rather overwhelming. "These provincial girls do, I find. It is not a failing, of course. Merely a matter of exposure." I was too far away to see Miss Morrow's expression, but I saw James's. He had the expression of a man who has watched something unpleasant happen and has made a very definite assessment. "Miss Morrow," he said, addressing her directly, as though the aside had not occurred, "you were about to tell me about the treatment of light in the lower left. Would you finish the thought?" The smallest possible intervention. Not a challenge, not a scene. A redirection accomplished in one sentence that placed Miss Morrow precisely where she had been before the interruption and placed the interruption precisely where it deserved to be. Nowhere. I watched Mrs. Galverton absorb this. The smile remained. She made some pleasantry and withdrew with perfect composure toward a safer quadrant of the room. And I thought, well, there it is. Something has tilted. I did not yet know how far it would tilt or what it would take. But something had shifted in the careful, clockwork world of James Southerly, 9th Duke of Harrowfield, and I was not the only one who had noticed. Part 4, The Weight of Machinery. A word about how London society treats the Elspeth Morrows of the world. It does not do so cruelly in any dramatic sense. There are no designated villains, no deliberate campaigns of coordinated cruelty. These things happen in fiction because fiction requires antagonists with deliberate intent. In life, the process is more efficient than that, and more impersonal, and for precisely those reasons more complete. What it does is classify. A young woman arrives with insufficient money and insufficient connections, or, as in Miss Morrow's case, with money and connections that were once present and are now absent, which is in some ways worse because it carries the social weight of having fallen, and the classification process begins immediately. 4 seconds, perhaps less. The gown is noted. The bearing assessed. The name searched in the rapid social index that everyone in these rooms maintains internally. The connections or absence of connections that the name implies are identified. The assessment is made, recorded, and the machinery moves on. This is not cruelty. It is efficiency. The season processes a great many people in a short time, and the machinery has been calibrated over generations to do this quickly and consistently. The people who operate it do not understand themselves to be operating machinery. They believe themselves to be exercising judgment, which is different and feels different, and makes them considerably harder to reason with. Once classified as insufficient, a young woman does not receive dramatic mistreatment. She receives indifference. She is present in rooms and the rooms flow around her. She speaks and the conversation resumes around her as though the pause her speaking created was simply a pause. She attempts to enter groups and finds that the groups have already, with perfect smoothness, reconfigured so that the entry point is no longer quite available. None of this is aimed at her specifically. She has not been selected for this treatment. She has been assigned to a category, and the category receives this treatment as a matter of course. The machinery is not interested in accuracy. It is interested in efficiency. I had watched this process operate for 30 years. I had not found a way to be comfortable with it, and I had not found a way to fight it directly, because the direct fight requires an individual to take on a collective, and collectives of this kind are designed to absorb direct challenges. You can push against them. The water closes around the push. The water is not harmed. You are quite tired. What was actually effective, what I had observed over 30 years to be the only thing actually effective, was not fighting the water but changing its temperature. Introducing something into the social environment that the machinery could not simply process and discard, protecting it long enough for the machinery to be forced to recalibrate. The Duke of Harrowfield, in this configuration, was extraordinarily positioned to do exactly this. The question was whether he was going to. The weeks following the watercolor exhibition were, from an external vantage, entirely conventional. James was present at the usual events. He danced with the daughters of suitable families when obligation required. He attended dinners and concerts and card parties with his customary punctiliousness. He was, in all outward respects, exactly what he had always been. But he appeared, as I have noted, at the Royal Institution lecture on natural philosophy on a Tuesday evening, not an event he would normally attend, when I had happened to mention that Miss Morrow had expressed an interest in the subject. I say happened to mention because this is technically accurate. I was not under any illusion about the significance of the mention. He positioned himself in the post-lecture conversation group that naturally included Miss Morrow and Miss Pemberton, the Berkshire baronet's daughter who had emerged as one of Miss Morrow's few genuinely warm social connections. He listened to her observations about the lecturer's theories on light refraction with that quality of arrested attention. She had listened to the lecture with the same concentrated quality she brought to the card table, and her observations were the kind that indicate genuine thinking rather than the social deployment of intellectual vocabulary. At one point, she said something, and he paused before responding in a way that communicated, to someone who knew him, that the thing she had said was more interesting than he had anticipated. He did not drive her home. He did not arrange a subsequent meeting. He simply thanked her correctly and left. But on the carriage home, he was quiet in the directed way of a man, continuing a conversation internally that he has just concluded externally. At Lady Whitmore's garden party, a young man of no particular quality, the son of a minor landowning family, equipped with neither money nor charm, but with a robust confidence in his own conversational appeal entirely unjustified by the evidence, had attached himself to Miss Morrow with the tenacity of a burr in thick wool, and was recounting, with great enthusiasm, the details of a fox-hunting incident that his listener was receiving with an expression of polite endurance. James arrived at the garden party at the moment I had suggested, in our Thursday dinner, would be most convenient. He made his way through the grounds and arrived in the vicinity of Miss Morrow's conversational captor, exchanged 2 brief pleasantries, and then redirected the conversation, with Lady Whitmore herself as the instrument, in a way that naturally absorbed Miss Morrow into a more interesting circle while leaving the young man behind. Executed so smoothly that I suspect Miss Morrow herself was not entirely certain whether it had been deliberate. but I was watching her face when she found herself in the new conversation group, and I saw the moment she registered what had happened. Not the dramatic recognition of a woman being rescued. Something quieter, the mild, observant noting of an action that was kind, and that also revealed something about the person who had taken it. She said nothing to James about it. She was too careful for that and too proud. But the quality of her attention toward him in the subsequent portion of the party had shifted. She was looking at him when she thought he was not observing her with the expression of someone who is revising an assessment. The Hookham's library incident. I have touched on it already, but let me add the detail that matters. She had initially tried to simply refuse the payment, to say, clearly and without apparent embarrassment, that she would manage the matter herself on another occasion. James had said something in response. I have this from a reliable source who was present. That was approximately this. That the matter was a practical inconvenience of precisely the order that any sensible person would eliminate if they had the means, and that he had the means, and that insisting on refusing it would accomplish nothing except prolonging the inconvenience. She had looked at him with the expression of someone assessing the precision of an argument, and then she had produced the pocketbook. The promissory note was for the exact amount, written in a clear, small hand, not the hand of someone who writes carelessly and trusts to legibility, dated with the exact date and specifying the nature of the obligation. The note of someone who takes obligations seriously and maintains records of them as a matter of principle, regardless of whether anyone will ever check. James put it in his waistcoat pocket and said something that made her look at him with the briefly startled expression, and then the very faint, very private almost smile. He kept the note. I saw it subsequently in the inner pocket of a particular waistcoat he appeared to be wearing with a frequency that was not coincidental. Part 5, the WLLUGHBY Ball. The Willoughby Ball was the largest event of the mid-season, the season at its most concentrated, which also meant its most pressured, and pressure has a way of revealing things. James and I arrived at 9, made the requisite initial circuit, and found ourselves, after the usual navigation, near the tall windows. James was surveying the room with the comprehensive automatic quality he brought to reading spaces. I saw him locate Miss Morrow before I had myself registered her presence. She was near the far windows, in a pale yellow gown that was clearly new, slightly better cut than her previous dresses, though still modest, and was in conversation with Miss Pemberton with the naturalness of two people who have found, in an environment that is frequently not natural, something genuinely comfortable. James began moving through the room toward her. He was doing it in that particular way, the studied casualness that would not have deceived anyone who had watched him long enough, because underneath it was the specific deliberateness of a man who knows exactly what he intends and is managing the appearance of spontaneity. I watched the room watch him move. The machinery was computing. I could see it, the rapid reassessment, the exchange of glances, the whispered calculations. He reached Miss Morrow's side, asked her to dance, and she accepted with the slight surprise that had become her habitual response to things he did. They danced the country dance. It was not the most intimate format, but it allowed observation, and what I observed was a quality of ease that surprised me. James was always technically correct in dancing, precise, accomplished, but ease was something else. Ease requires comfort with where you are and who you are with. He had that ease now. I marked it. After the dance, they were talking, and James had that quality of inclined attention, the very slight forward lean of a man listening to something he finds genuinely interesting. And then Lady Alverston arrived. Lady Alverston, excellent breeding, impeccable manner, and a temperature somewhat north of what organic warmth would explain. She had become, in the last several weeks, increasingly vocal in certain circles about her opinion of the Duke's developing interest in the Morrow girl. The opinion was not favorable. She arrived at James's elbow with perfect timing, addressed him with perfect warmth, and acknowledged Miss Morrow with a nod that was technically gracious and substantively dismissive. A piece of social technique so practiced it was nearly art. Your Grace, I had not realized you were acquainted with, a fractional pause calibrated to the second, the Morrow girl. The Morrow girl, not Miss Morrow. The indefinite article deployed with such precision that it contained, in those 3 words, an entire assessment, not a person, not an individual, simply a category. A nobody politely indicated. Indeed, said James pleasantly, Miss Morrow. He gave the name its form and its full weight. I find her company very pleasant. Lady Alverston's smile adjusted itself. How charming, she said. She is a sweet girl, I'm sure, though rather out of her depth in town, one imagines. These provincial girls, one does feel for them. They haven't had the advantages. I cannot speak to that, said James. I have not found her out of her depth in any conversation I have had with her. Precise as a surgical instrument, not challenging with heat, simply offering a factual correction, the evidence of his own experience contradicted the assertion. The manner was perfect civility. The content said, you are wrong about something, and I know it. Lady Alverston navigated this with skill. Well, she said, no doubt you are very kind, your grace, and she withdrew. James turned back to Miss Morrow. I watched her face as he said whatever he said, and I watched the expression move through it, the briefly startled quality his actions kept producing in her, and then the composing, and then the almost smile. The private one. I thought, now it is out, now we see what it costs. Part 6, the cost of it. The cost arrived, as these things do, in increments. First the whispers, then the louder registers of drawing rooms. Mrs. Galverton developed a position on the matter and expressed it with frequency. Lady Alverston expressed her personal concern for the Duke's family name. A number of families with daughters who had spent the season hoping for what Miss Morrow appeared to be receiving revised their assessment of her from irrelevant to threatening, which carries specific social consequences. Miss Morrow managed it with a composure I found, the longer I observed it, increasingly remarkable. Not because composure is unusual, London produces composure as a survival strategy, but because hers had a quality of authenticity that most composure lacks. It was not a face placed over a different face. It was simply the face she had. But I was watching closely, and I saw what it cost. The slight additional deliberateness, on some evenings, of the control. The moments when the straightening of her posture was fractionally more effortful than it had been before. She was 21, and she had been managing the machinery all season, and the management was accumulating. I encountered Mrs. Morrow twice during this period, and saw in her face the anxiety of a woman who loves her daughter, and can see the social landscape grinding against her, and is not certain there is anything to be done about it. She understood with clarity that the Duke's attention had cast Elspeth into a spotlight that was more exposing than protective. The spotlight had not yet produced the thing she hoped, broad approval, and in the meantime it was doing the thing she feared, which was making every existing difficulty more visible. Miss Morrow, for her part, was managing her mother too. I could see it in how she positioned herself at events, slightly forward, slightly protective, the way you stand in front of something fragile when the wind is coming from the wrong direction. She had, I was beginning to understand, been managing things for a long time. It was at Almack's that everything crystallized. Almack's was the apex, the sternest, most exacting social institution of the season, presided over by its patronesses with a rigor that made military tribunals seem casual. Vouchers were extended to those deemed sufficiently acceptable. The list of those deemed insufficiently acceptable was long and vigorously maintained. Getting a voucher when you were without significant fortune or connections was an achievement of some difficulty. Miss Morrow had obtained one through Lady Whitmore, who had genuine liking for her, and had spent some social capital on the matter. The result was that her presence at Almack's was legitimate and properly authorized, and had about it the quality of a precarious achievement, something that could be made uncomfortable if the wrong person decided to make it so. The wrong person in this instance was Miss Cecily Denborough. Miss Denborough was the particular kind of young woman formed entirely by her advantages. Beautiful, well-connected, possessed of a fortune that made her matrimonial prospects essentially impregnable, accustomed to being the brightest thing in any room she entered. She was not cruel in any deliberate way. She was reflexively dismissive of anything that might compete with her position, in the way of someone who has always had the best of everything, and finds lesser things vaguely irritating without quite realizing this irritation has a specific cause. She had fixed on Miss Morrow as an irritant 3 weeks into the season, for reasons that had entirely to do with the attention of the Duke of Harrowfield. At Almack's that July evening, she positioned herself near enough to Miss Morrow and said things, to a companion in the voice that is not quite a voice but is perfectly audible to its intended audience, that I caught in fragments. Presumptuous, out of her depth. His family must be horrified. He'll come to his senses. One does feel for him. Miss Morrow heard it. I know because I was watching her, and I saw the exact moment it reached her. The arrest in movement instantly controlled. And then the straightening. That thing she did, the postural refusal to collapse, the refusal also to perform the refusal, simply the straightening and the continuation. But this time the straightening cost her more than I had seen it cost. There was something in her face, in the fraction of a second before the control asserted itself, that I had not seen before. Not tears, she would not cry. I was by now confident of this. Something more fundamental, the expression of exhaustion that does not permit itself to be visible, that has to be managed even in the moment it is felt. She was 21. She had been managing this all season. She was very good at it. And she was tired. James saw it. I know because I was watching her when it happened. And I watched what happened in his face, not anger precisely, or rather anger, yes, but something underneath the anger that was not anger. The specific stillness that preceded in James the making of a decision. He made himself wait, not because he was uncertain, but because the immediate movement would have been too much, would have made her the center of a scene when what she needed was the opposite. He continued the conversation he was in for the required time, and then he crossed to where Miss Denborough's group was assembled, stopping near enough to address them, and looked at Miss Denborough. Miss Denborough, perfectly courteous, nothing in the tone that was not civil. But that quality of attention, complete, undeceived, frightening in its precision, made the group go entirely still. I wonder if you would be so good as to repeat, for my benefit, what you were just saying. Miss Denborough held his gaze without flinching. She had genuine composure. I was speaking of the season generally, Your Grace, nothing of consequence. I see, said James. The pause was brief and entirely deliberate. I had rather thought I heard something of consequence to a specific person. I hope I was mistaken. Not an accusation, no raised voice, nothing that could be characterized as a scene. But clearly, unambiguously, in front of the assembled company, he had heard, he had identified the source, he was not mistaken, and he was saying so. The silence in the portion of the room, within range of the exchange, became comprehensive. Then James turned away and crossed to where Miss Morrow was standing, and offered his arm. I believe the musicians are ready, he said. Will you dance with me? She looked at him fully, directly, without the managed composure, with the expression I was coming to recognize as her equivalent of a declaration. Yes, she said, I will. They moved to the floor. The waltz at Almack's is not a neutral social act. To ask a young woman to waltz there is to make a statement. To do it in front of the assembled company is to make that statement public and deliberate and intended to be seen. James had been navigating Almack's for 16 years. There was nothing in the selection of the waltz that was not chosen. They danced, and the assembled company watched them dance, and I watched the social world absorb what it was watching and begin, with the characteristic speed of a machine recalibrating, to revise its assessment. Part 7, the interior country. I need to pause here, because without some account of what was happening inside James, the events I am describing are merely external, the movements of figures in a social landscape, and I want to convey what they actually were. James was not experiencing romantic infatuation in any simple sense. I had watched him over 30 years, and was confident that infatuation was not something he was constitutionally prone to. He was a man of deep self-discipline and measured judgment, and when things moved him, which they did, though he generally kept this private, the movement was slow and deep rather than fast and visible. What was happening with Miss Morrow was specific. He had, in 16 years of being the Duke of Harrowfield, become accustomed to a particular set of social performances, his own and everyone else's. People performed, for him, versions of themselves constructed around what they knew or suspected he wanted to see. The deference of those who wanted his patronage, the calculated warmth of women who wished to be his duchess, the joviality of men who needed his goodwill, the intellectual display of people who hoped he would find them interesting. He had grown very good at seeing through these performances. They were not, in most cases, difficult to see through. The construction was evident because it was performed, and performance has a specific quality that distinguishes it from the real thing. He could see through them without difficulty, and had long since ceased to find the seeing through interesting. Miss Morrow had, as far as he could determine, no performance. This was not to say she was simple or artless, she was neither. But everything he had observed of her had the quality of something genuine and consistent, and not modulated for his benefit. The wry private amusement in the moment of the spilled lemonade. The answer about her father, which was true and offered without regard for whether it was useful. The promissory note for the library debt. The question she asked him, the direct, uncomfortable, important question about whether he was confused. The straightening of her posture at Almack's, which was not performed for anyone. He had seen it before she knew he was watching. She was simply herself, in a way that did not shift according to social pressure. For a man who had spent 16 years surrounded by people who were never simply themselves, this was not a small thing. He told me on a Thursday evening in late July, the port had gone, the evening was late, and he had been quieter than usual, that he found himself thinking about what she would say about whatever he was looking at. At dinner in discussion, simply whatever was happening. The imagined response more interesting than the actual company he was in. "She is a very intelligent woman," I said carefully. "Yes, though that is not the whole of it." I waited. "She is honest," he said, after a pause that had the quality of a man selecting words with exactness. "In a way that is so constant that one does not always notice it immediately as a distinct quality. It is simply the air the conversations breathe, and then one notices it and cannot unnotice it." He was quiet. Then, "I should like to speak to her mother." I arranged the preliminary visit. Mrs. Morrow received me in the drawing room at Half Moon Street, a small room beautifully maintained, with the specific quality of care that exists when someone has invested attention because expenditure is not available. The furniture good and older, the curtains clean and faded, the flowers in the vase from someone's garden. I explained that the Duke wished to call. Mrs. Morrow's face moved through hope, terror, calculation, something near grief, and then a steadying. "Elspeth should know." And then, with unexpected firmness, "She will not be purchased, whatever our circumstances. She is not fortunate to be noticed. She will not be made to feel grateful." I liked Mrs. Morrow considerably in that moment. "He knows the difference," I said, "between a woman who accepts because it is the practical conclusion and a woman whose genuine regard he wishes to earn. The distinction is rather central to his interest." She looked at me with the direct steadiness of a woman who has learned to read people accurately through necessity. "You have known him a long time." 30 years. "And you believe he means this honorably?" "I believe," I said, "that I have not seen him mean anything this seriously in those 30 years. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I will speak to Elspeth." Part 8, the call, at Half Moon Street. James called 2 days later at the correct time, correctly dressed, carrying nothing, no flowers, no elaborate token. He had thought carefully about how to enter that small drawing room without overwhelming it. Mrs. Morrow received him, and after the requisite few minutes of conversation, excused herself on some transparent pretext. I was not in the room. I sat in the small hall with a cup of tea that the housekeeper produced, feeling thoroughly aware of my own ridiculousness, and counted the minutes. 40 of them. The drawing room door opened. James emerged. He looked, the only way I can describe it, as though he had just had an experience that was both very good and rather unnerving, which was approximately the correct description. "Well," I said when we were on the street. "She asked me," he said, "whether I was quite certain I was not confused. I stopped walking. She asked you to your face whether your interest in her might be a passing fancy." "More precisely than that." He was quiet a moment, retrieving the words accurately. "She said she had observed this season a pattern in which men of significant position become interested in women who present something unfamiliar, a puzzle, or a quality of novelty, or the specific experience of being encountered by someone who does not treat them as a position, and that this interest is genuinely felt but not always durable. She asked me to consider whether I was in that category." "What did you say?" James looked at the middle distance, and there was something in his face that was entirely new, a quality of openness, like a sealed room through which air was now moving. "I said she was right to ask, that it was the correct question, that I had asked it myself, and that the answer I had arrived at was that I had spent 6 weeks thinking about her opinion of things in situations where she was not present, and finding those imagined opinions more accurate and more interesting than the actual opinions of people who were, and that this did not seem consistent with the category she had described. A pause, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said she found that a satisfactory answer. Part 9, RAVNSWOOD Park. Lord Ravenswood's house party in Buckinghamshire was the last significant social event of the season. 3 days, 30 guests, the country house in its summer fullness. Both James and Miss Morrow were of the party. Miss Denborough was also of the party, which I noted as a complication. The first evening was dinner and cards and the usual navigation. The house was beautiful, the company was the best the season offered, and there was a quality of tension beneath the surface that I tracked. The second day brought good weather. Several members of the party dispersed toward the grounds in the afternoon. By one of those arrangements that are never entirely accidental, James and I came upon Miss Morrow near the lake, seated on a stone bench with a small volume open in her lap, reading with the genuine concentration of someone actually interested in what they are reading. She looked up when she heard our approach and registered James's presence with the composure that had become, I thought, slightly more careful than before. Not defensive. Careful. The composure of someone who has learned over a difficult season to hold something in reserve. James greeted her, they began to talk, and I excused myself to the adjacent bench with the ease of 30 years of strategic withdrawal, and appeared to be interested in the lake. For 45 minutes I could not hear the content of the conversation. I observed the quality of it, the ease, the naturalness, the longer pauses that were comfortable rather than awkward. Twice something was said that produced a response in the other that was genuinely unguarded rather than managed. There was one moment, I cannot say what preceded it, when she said something and looked away toward the lake as she was saying it, and James was very still before he replied. His reply made her turn back toward him with the expression I had come to recognize as her equivalent of a declaration. Direct, unperformed, precisely focused. She nodded slowly, the way one nods when something has been said that one has been waiting without knowing it to hear. When they returned to the house, she was walking beside him. The evening party on the third day was when the accumulated tension of the season arrived at its head. Miss Denborough had spent the 2 preceding days making calculations. I had watched her making them, the assessing looks, the tracking of interaction between James and Miss Morrow with the attention of someone determining what to do about it. She was not driven by malice, I want to be clear. She was driven by the specific discomfort of a young woman who has always been the brightest object in any room, finding that this particular room has organized itself around someone else, and by the social training that told her this was a correctable situation. The tool she selected was the one she was best at, the remark that travels. The observation delivered to a small group at the precise volume that reaches its intended audience without being directly attributable. Before the dancing, when the company was circulating, Miss Denborough gathered a small group, Lady Alverston among them, and said things that I caught in fragments. Presumptuous. One does feel for her so clearly out of place. His family must be finding it extremely awkward. Of course, a man of his position feels a certain obligation to be kind to people in difficulty, but kindness is not, well, one understands the distinction. She'll come to her senses eventually, these infatuations do. Miss Morrow heard it. I was watching her and I saw the exact moment. The arrest in movement, the immediate control, the straightening. But this time the straightening was different. It cost more. I could see it costing more. There was something in her face, in the fraction of a second before the control reasserted, that I had not seen there on previous occasions. Not tears. Something more fundamental. The expression of a person who is very tired of a particular effort and has not found a way to put it down. She was 21. She had been managing this all season, from the first evening at the Hardington ball through every subsequent event where she had straightened her posture and continued the conversation and declined to give the machinery the satisfaction of a visible reaction. She had been excellent at it, and she was tired. James saw it. I know because I was watching his face when it happened. And I watched what happened in his expression, that specific stillness that preceded in James the making of a decision. He made himself wait, not from uncertainty but from calculation. The immediate cross would have been too much, would have made her the center of a scene when what she needed was not a scene. He continued the conversation he was in for the required time, and then he moved. He crossed to where Miss Denborough's group was assembled, stopped near enough to address them, looked at Miss Denborough. Miss Denborough, perfectly courteous. Nothing in the tone that was not civil. But that quality of attention, complete, undeceived, frightening, made the group go entirely still. I wonder if you would be so good as to repeat, for my benefit, what you were just saying. She held his gaze. I was speaking of the season generally, Your Grace, nothing of consequence. I see. The pause was brief and entirely deliberate. I had rather thought I heard something of consequence to a specific person. I hope I was mistaken. Not an accusation, no raised voice. But clearly in front of everyone he had heard, he knew the source, he was not deceived, and he was saying so. The silence in the room became comprehensive. Then James turned away and crossed to where Miss Morrow was standing, and offered his arm. I believe the musicians are ready, he said. Will you dance with me? She looked at him directly, without the managed composure, with the expression I had seen at the stone bench by the lake. Yes, she said, I will. They moved to the floor together, and the assembled company of Ravenswood Park watched, and made of what they were watching whatever they were going to make of it. Part 10, the library. Late in the evening, when the dancing had given way to supper and the supper to dispersal, I went to Lord Ravenswood's library in search of a volume I had seen there the previous afternoon. I opened the door. James was there. Miss Morrow was there. Their conversation was underway, and its character, two people talking without managing the talk, real and easy and private, was unmistakable. I should have withdrawn immediately. What stopped me was a sentence. Miss Morrow was saying, clearly and without drama, I need you to understand that I am not grateful. I want that to be clear between us. I froze in the doorway. I made the decision, for which I have occasionally reproached myself since, to remain very still. James said, Tell me what you mean. I mean, she said, that everything you have done this season, the gallery Almack's this evening, it has been genuinely kind. More than kind. And I cannot be the kind of woman who receives that order of kindness and transforms it into something it might not be, because the alternative is uncomfortable. A pause. I need you to know that I understand the difference between what you have done and what it necessarily means. Do you believe, James said carefully, that I am doing those things out of kindness? Silence. I believe, she said, that you are a man of genuine honor who feels the weight of what you can offer and what others cannot, and that you are sometimes moved to correct situations that seem to you unjust. And I believe that I present in your current social landscape a situation that seems unjust. Another pause. And I do not wish to be a correction. James was very quiet. Elspeth, he said. The name, the first time he had used it. After all the months of correct address, the first time he had used her name, and the use of it had the weight of something that had been carried for a long time and had finally been set down in the right place. What I feel for you, he said, has nothing to do with injustice as a category. Silence. What I feel for you is specific. It is entirely to do with you, not the situation. You asking me to my face whether I was confused because you thought it was the important question and you were going to ask it regardless of whether asking it was comfortable. You finding the thing in the Cotman that everyone else had walked past. You writing the promissory note in a neat hand on a page from a pocket book, because you were going to repay it, and you were going to have a record of the obligation because that is how you operate. Not because it was required, but because it was correct, and you do not appear to know any other way to be. Silence. I have been present in every significant drawing room in London for 16 years, he said. I have encountered everyone that London considers worth encountering, and I find, quite simply, that you are the most interesting person I have encountered in those 16 years, and that the thought of navigating any subsequent period without the specific pleasure of your company and your judgment is one I would like very much to avoid. He paused. That is not kindness, he said. That is the most honest thing I have said to anyone in a very long time. A long silence. I am afraid, she said. Her voice was different. The composure was still there, but different composure. The composure of something that has been very carefully held and is now, carefully, allowing itself to be a little less held. Of what, he asked. Of wanting this too much. Of saying yes and then finding I was wrong about what I believed about you, about what this is. Of she paused. I have been tracking the costs all season, every event where someone said something and I straightened my posture and continued the conversation. I have been very good at the tracking, but the costs accumulate, And I am? Another pause. I am not as strong as people appear to believe. What people appear to believe, James said, and what is actually true are two different things, and I have been watching the difference all season. Then you know. I know you are not strong in the way people usually mean the word, he said. You are determined. There is a distinction. Strength has a limit. When the limit is reached, the thing collapses. Determination is a quality of character that doesn't run out in the same way. It simply continues. A pause. I don't want it to stop being difficult because of position, she said, because it becomes easier once you marry the Duke of Harrowfield and the Whispers find something else to be about. I want the costs to stop because they should never have existed in the first place. Not because I've found a position that makes me immune to them. You are right, he said. They should not have existed. They were the result of the machinery assessing you by the wrong criteria. But they were real, she said. They were real, he agreed. And they will not be undone, even after. No, he said, not fully. There will be other costs of different kinds. I will not pretend otherwise. A very long pause, the kind in which things are being measured very carefully against each other. But I will, he said, share every one of them. From this point forward you will not track them alone, that I can promise. The silence that followed had a quality entirely unlike all the controlled silences I had been listening to for months. The silence of something very carefully held, allowing itself, with great care, to open. Yes, she said quietly, simply. Yes, he said, and in that word I heard something I had never heard in 16 years of knowing him. A waiting. Something that had laid itself on the table and was asking to be told what it was worth. Yes, she said again, though I should tell you. What? My posture will still straighten, she said. When people are unpleasant, I cannot seem to help it. And James Sutherly, the 9th Duke of Harrowfield, the richest duke in England, the most frightening man in most rooms he entered, laughed. Genuinely, freely, with the specific quality of laughter that belongs to moments when someone you love says something that is perfectly and unexpectedly funny. The laughter of being surprised into joy by a person whose particular way of being in the world has become, without your quite noticing it, indispensable. I withdrew very quietly from the doorway and went to find a different book. Part 11, what followed? The announcement was made in the appropriate manner. The column notice, the family letters, the call from James to his solicitor, and the letter to Mrs. Morrow, which she described to me with wet eyes and considerable precision as the most correct and careful and unexpectedly warm letter she had ever received in her life. London society received the news the way it receives things it has been watching develop for months while insisting to itself that they were not developing, with a brief, absorbing silence and then a great noise of revision. The revision was of mixed character. Lady Whitmore and Miss Pemberton were genuinely, warmly pleased. Various people who had watched the season with clearer eyes than the general dispatched warm congratulations to Half Moon Street with commendable speed. Various others who had been unkind were now experiencing the specific discomfort of people whose assessments have proved publicly and comprehensively wrong. Mrs. Galverton said several things that subsequently required qualification. Miss Denborough departed London for the country somewhat earlier than originally planned. Lady Alverston expressed her warm congratulations at the first available opportunity, with a grace that would have been entirely convincing to anyone who hadn't spent 3 months watching her express the opposite. The social world adjusted. It is very good at adjusting. The adjustment was not gracious, but it was efficient, which was consistent with its character. Miss Morrow navigated the revision as she had navigated everything else, exactly herself. Warm where warmth was genuine, correct where it was not. Equally composed, receiving the belated congratulations of people who had spent the season calling her nobody, and the genuine warmth of those who had been her allies throughout. James watched her navigate it with an expression I had not seen on his face before and have thought about many times since. The expression of a man being shown something he has not seen before and is very glad to be seeing. Part 12, the wedding. The wedding was in November at the parish church serving the Harrowfield London house, not the grandest available venue. James had offered whatever she wished. She had used that scope with characteristic economy. The guest list was composed of people with genuine connections to one or both of them. The flowers were abundant but not elaborate. The general quality of the thing was right, arranged by someone with good judgment and without excessive interest in the performance of it. I sat in the front pew. Mrs. Morrow sat across the aisle and wept very steadily into a handkerchief prepared in advance for the purpose. Elspeth Morrow came down the aisle in a gown that was simple in the specific way of things that are exactly sufficient, nothing added, nothing missing. She walked with the same natural ease and bearing she had always had, in every drawing room and ballroom that had spent the season assessing her and finding her insufficient. She looked at James when she reached him with the same direct, unperformed quality of attention she had given him since the first time he asked her to look at the Cotman. And the expression on his face when he looked back at her, I could see it clearly from the front pew, was the expression of a man who has spent a long time in a world of surfaces and has found, at last, something entirely solid. The ceremony was correct and beautiful, which is to say, it was true, and true things have a particular beauty that ornament neither adds to nor replaces. Afterward, in the vestibule, James found a moment to say something to me, quiet enough that only I heard it. She asked me this morning whether I was certain I was not confused. I stared at him, this morning, before leaving for the church. What did you say? I said I had been certain since the library. A pause. She found that satisfactory. The Duchess of Harrowfield, at that moment, was accepting congratulations from Lady Whitmore with warmth that was entirely genuine and a grace that was, I recognized it now, saw it differently than I had all season. Not the managed composure of someone enduring difficulty, but the natural ease of someone who is, finally, simply where she is. She caught my eye across the vestibule. The corner of her mouth curved very slightly in the private way. Not a smile for the room. A smile because something was, in fact, specifically and quietly amusing, shared with the one person who had been there for all of it. I smiled back. Epilogue, HAROWFALD. I visited them at Harrowfield in the early spring of the following year. The estate was everything legend had made it, and also more. Vast, beautifully maintained, with the specific quality of a house genuinely loved over generations by people who knew how to love it. James met me at the entrance and walked me through rooms of considerable grandeur that had about them, nonetheless, a quality of being inhabited. The fires laid before they were needed, the flowers in the rooms people actually used, the books on the library table currently being read. The Duchess of Harrowfield was in the walled garden when I arrived, in serious conversation with the head gardener about the siting of a new kitchen garden. She finished the conversation, because the matter was not yet concluded, and it was important, before coming to greet me. The same quality of character that had once insisted on a promissory note for a library debt. She was, I thought, standing in the spring garden of one of the most substantial estates in England, exactly herself. Not larger or smaller than she had been in the drawing-room at Half Moon Street, in the pale blue gown that was not quite this season's cut. She had absorbed the scale of what she had married into and made of it, with the same quiet determination she applied to everything, something that fitted her. We sat in the garden, the three of us, with tea that appeared without ceremony and conversation that ranged from the estate to recent reading to the political news to a long dispute about a point of natural philosophy that lasted nearly an hour, and ended only when James declared that the Duchess was simply correct, and I was being obstinate. She did not gloat. She found it privately amusing, in the way she found a great many things privately amusing, which was, I understood now, one of the several hundred things that James had fallen in love with specifically. Later, walking the grounds before dinner, James and I walked in the comfortable silence of very old friendship. Then he said, "She still straightens her posture when someone at a dinner says something unkind." "I assumed she would," I said. "The difference," he said, "is that she straightens it and then glances at me, and I glance at her. And afterward we have a conversation about the dinner party that is considerably more interesting than anything actually said at the dinner party." I thought about the card room at Mrs. Galverton's, the Cotman in the corner, the promissory note in neat hand on a page from a pocket book, the answer about the father who had died 3 years ago given without self-pity and without calculation, simply because it was true. The question she had asked him, the important, uncomfortable, necessary question, directly to his face. The straightening. Always the straightening. "She was never nobody," I said. "No," said James quietly. "She was never nobody. She was someone the room had not yet learned to see. We walked on, through the grounds of Harrowfield, in the spring light. And somewhere in the house behind us, the Duchess was arranging something, or finishing a letter, or asking the gardener a serious question about the kitchen garden, and being, simply, entirely, without any version of performance, exactly who she was. Who she had always been. From the very first moment in the corner of the Hardington ballroom, when she spilled a little lemonade on her sleeve and found it, privately, quietly, entirely honestly, amusing. End of story. Phase 1 Production Notes, Entry 11. Field Value. Entry 11. Date 2020, 60727. Engine a dismissed right arrow chosen. Narrator the Duke's closest friend, male. Unnamed older gentleman of 52 at the time of events, writing retrospectively at 72. Heroine ruined family daughter, Elspeth Morrow, Shropshire, 21. Delayed come out after father's death. Trigger setup called Nobody. The Morrow girl/provincial girl mocked as unfit at every major season event. The Duke, the richest Duke in England, James Aldrich Sutherly, 9th Duke of Harrowfield, entirely invented. Setting London season. Hardington Ball/card party/watercolor exhibition. Almax/Willoughby Ball/Ravenswood Park house party. Wedding in November. Ending type chosen before a shocked society. The cruel humbled/library declaration, November wedding. Mood register sweeping vindication, right arrow devotion, quietly triumphant. Film seed, mood only. The Deceiver, 1931. Atmosphere of hidden worth unmasked before an audience. Genuine feeling versus cold social machinery. The moment truth is stripped bare in public, woven throughout in the progressive revelation of Elspeth's character before increasing social observation. Banned tropes, no. Real people, none. Explicit content, none. Modern anachronism, none. Female narrator, no. Male retrospective narrator throughout. Word count target, words, 180 min times 185 WPM. Story log update, append this row. 11/20/20 He was the richest Duke in England, she was nobody. And he made her his everything of the Duke's closest friend, male, ruined family daughter, Elspeth Morrow, Shropshire, 21. Called Nobody, the Morrow girl/provincial girl, mocked as unfit at season events the richest Duke, James Aldrich Sutherly, Duke of Harrowfield. Invented, Hardington Ball/card party Almax/Willoughby Ball/Ravenswood Park house party chosen before a shocked society/library declaration, November wedding, sweeping vindication, right arrow devotion, quietly triumphant, no 180 min target. Film seed, The Deceiver, 1931, mood only. Title log update, append this row. 11/20/20 He was the richest Duke in England, she was nobody. And he made her his everything a ruined family daughter called Nobody by society. He chose her before a shocked and recalculating society. The library declaration, the waltz, the cruel humbled nun he entry 11. A1 DNA last used entry 1 10 entries ago. Fresh opening word he. Fresh ducal epithet richest Duke/Harrowfield. Fresh heroine framing. Hash expansion, additional depth across all parts. The following passages expand and deepen existing sections to reach the 33,300 word target for a 180-minute audio. They slot into the narrative chronologically and should be read as continuous with the sections above. Expanding Part 1, on the character of the observer. Before I return to the events of the season itself, I want to say something about what it means to be a witness. Because the account I am giving you is filtered through a particular kind of intelligence, not James's, which was cold and precise, and not Elspeth's, which was warm and precise, but mine, which is the intelligence of a man who spent 50 years watching other people live and developed, through that watching, a specific kind of knowledge. The knowledge of the witness is not the same as the knowledge of the participant. The participant lives from the inside, experiences the heat of it, the fear of it, the particular density of moments that are being lived rather than observed. The witness lives from a small step outside, and what the witness sees is sometimes invisible to the participant. The patterns, the rhythms, the ways in which particular moments are continuous with other moments that the participant, living in the middle of things, may not yet be able to connect. I was a good witness. I say this without false modesty because it is simply accurate, and false modesty would misserve the account. I had spent 3 decades in James's company and had learned to read him with a precision that most people, even people who knew him well and respected him greatly, could not match. I had spent those same 3 decades in the drawing rooms and dining rooms and card parties and assemblies of London society, and had learned to read the social landscape with a similar precision. What I saw in the spring and summer of 1843 was something that I had not seen in 3 decades of watching. It was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It arrived, as real things have a tendency to arrive, quietly and without ceremony, and with the specific quality of the inevitable, the sense, when you look back on it, that of course it could only have gone this way, though nothing at the time suggested that it was going any particular way at all. I want to be careful about the retrospective imposition of meaning. 50 years after the fact, with the whole shape of it visible, it is very easy to see the Cotman exhibition and Mrs. Galverton's card party and the Thursday dinner conversation as a sequence moving toward a destination. At the time, they were simply events. James was a man who was slightly more attentive than usual. Miss Morrow was a young woman navigating an exceptionally difficult season. The connection between these two facts was not, for several weeks, apparent to me. But I was watching, and watching is not nothing. Expanding Part 2. On the machinery of assessment, A.T. Greaterly. I have spoken already about the machinery by which London society classifies its intake. I want to speak more precisely about it, because imprecision here would misrepresent what Miss Morrow was facing. The machinery operates in tiers. The first tier is appearance, the immediate and automatic assessment of gown, hair, jewelry, bearing. This assessment takes perhaps 3 seconds and is made by everyone in the vicinity simultaneously. It is not a conscious process exactly, it is more like the way the eye adjusts to light, an automatic recalibration of the social environment based on the new information present. The assessment produces a preliminary classification. Very wealthy, comfortable, modest, struggling. This classification is provisional and can be revised by the second tier. The second tier is connection, the rapid cross-referencing of the name against the social index. Who are the family? What is their lineage? What are their existing connections? Who brought them? Who received them? The connection assessment can elevate or reduce the preliminary classification significantly. A girl of modest appearance from an excellent family can be reclassified upward immediately. A girl of very good appearance from an uncertain family can be held at her preliminary classification or revised downward. The third tier is the sustained assessment. The quality of conversation, the behavior over the course of an event, the way a person moves through a room, the assessments offered by people already trusted by the assessor. This is where character could, in theory, revise the classification further. In practice, it rarely does, because the character being assessed at this tier is rarely the actual character of the person. It is the performed version of the character, modulated toward what the social environment rewards. And what the social environment rewards is a very narrow set of qualities that are not, in any deep sense, character at all. Miss Morrow presented poorly at the first 2 tiers. Her appearance was modest in a way that could not be mistaken for fashionable restraint. Her name, when cross-referenced, produced a classification of previously respectable, currently precarious, financially insufficient, connection-adjacent but not connection-solid asterisk. By the end of the second tier, she was classified as not quite the thing, and this classification was essentially fixed. The third tier, in her case, was never genuinely operated. The people who encountered her at card parties and exhibitions and balls had already classified her as not quite the thing, and what they were assessing in the third tier was not her actual character, her honesty, her quiet determination, her quality of attention, the specific way she answered questions, but rather the degree to which she was performing the appropriate level of gratitude for being present at events that were, technically, above her current social classification. And she was not performing that gratitude, which produced its own reclassification. Not ungrateful exactly, but strange, difficult to place, not quite fitting the expected behavioral pattern for her category. This is what the machinery could not process about her. The behavioral pattern it expected from someone in her category was a specific combination of gratitude and aspiration, a girl who understood herself to be fortunate to be there, and who signaled this understanding through a particular quality of social effort. Miss Morrow did not signal this understanding because she did not feel it. She was not ungrateful for invitations, but she did not experience herself as fortunate to be in rooms that were, in her private estimation, no more remarkable than rooms she had been in before, simply more expensive. And this absence of performed gratitude produced, in the people around her, a quality of unease. She did not fit the expected pattern, and things that do not fit expected patterns are unsettling. James had been watching this. Not with sympathy initially. James did not extend sympathy as a general social practice. What he extended was observation, and what he observed was that the pattern was wrong. The classification was the result of applying the wrong criteria, and the behavioral unease the assessment produced was the result of expecting behaviors that were inconsistent with the actual character being assessed. This kind of classification error was, to James, a problem of the same order as any other classification error. It was simply inaccurate, and inaccuracy, to James, was the one thing he found genuinely intolerable. But there was more than this. There was the specific character of what he was observing. Because what the machinery had classified as not quite the thing was, in James's direct observation, quite precisely the thing that the machinery was not designed to detect, and therefore could not find. But that was evident to someone who was not operating the machinery but was simply looking. He was looking at someone who was honest, who was intelligent, who found things genuinely amusing rather than performing amusement, who gave true answers when true answers were what was asked for, who insisted on promissory notes and took the measure of her own anxiety without dramatizing it, and straightened her posture instead of collapsing, and asked the important question directly to the face of the person who needed to be asked it. He was looking, in other words, at someone real. And in 16 years of the social season, he had encountered very few of those. Expanding Part 3, more on the weeks between. The weeks between the watercolor exhibition and the Willoughby ball were, as I have said, externally conventional but internally significant. I want to give them more texture, because texture is where meaning lives in these things. James and I dined on Thursday evenings, and the Thursdays of those weeks had a particular quality. Not dramatic. James did not become dramatic about anything. It was constitutionally foreign to him. But there was a difference in the character of the dinners, a quality of interior attention that was different from the more expansive engagement of the conversations we usually had. On the Thursday 2 weeks after the watercolor exhibition, he said something I did not quite know what to do with at the time. He said, "Tell me what you know about her actual situation." Not the family situation, I had already given him that. He meant the present situation, the house in Half Moon Street, the circumstances of the household, the practical daily reality of what Miss Morrow's life looked like. I told him what I knew, which was imprecise but not nothing. The house in Half Moon Street was a good address for the money available, taken on a short lease and maintained with evident care. Mrs. Morrow had 2 servants, one of whom doubled as cook. The household ran carefully, which meant that the season, the tickets, the appropriate dress, the small social expenditures that the season required, was consuming the greater part of what the maternal aunt's inheritance permitted. James listened to all of this with the quality of attention he gave to information he considered practically important. The promissory note amount, he said, it was trivial. Yes, I said. And she made the note nonetheless. She did. A pause. She did not make it to satisfy a social convention, he said. She made it because she considered the obligation real. I believe that is correct. Another pause. There is a quality, he said slowly with the care of a man choosing words that are exactly right, of integrity of practice. Of someone who does the right thing when no one is watching and when there is no social advantage to doing the right thing, because it is simply the right thing and that is how they operate. He was quiet. I find this, he said, almost entirely unlike anything I encounter in the normal course of my life. I said nothing. It did not seem to require a response. I am speaking, he said, about the absence of calculation, not the absence of intelligence. The intelligence is clearly there, the card playing, the observation about Constable, the observation about the light refraction in the lecture. But the intelligence is not being deployed in the service of social advancement. It is simply present, operating in its natural state. He looked at his glass. I had not quite known, he said, how much I had become accustomed to never encountering this. There was another Thursday, a fortnight later, when we had been discussing a legal matter, something involving the Harrowfield mines and a dispute about a boundary that had been dragging through the courts for years. And I noticed, midway through the second course, that James had stopped attending to what I was saying with his usual quality of attention. He was still listening. He was processing the content accurately. His responses were cogent. But the particular quality of engagement, the specific focused interest he usually brought to problems of this kind, was slightly elsewhere. I waited until the port. "The Morrow girl," I said. He looked at me. "I assumed," I said. "I may be wrong." A pause. "You are not wrong," he said. "What specifically?" He considered. "I was thinking," he said, "about the drawing room at the card party, after the Galverton woman spoke to her. The way she picked up her cards, not performing composure, not suppressing a reaction, simply returning her attention to the game because the remark had been addressed and the game required attention." "Yes," I said. "There was no residue," he said. "Of the exchange, she did not carry it into the next hand. She simply set it down and returned to what was in front of her." A pause. "I have been in rooms with people for 30 years, he said, "and I cannot think of many people who manage that." I thought about this. "It requires," I said, "not caring very much what a particular person thinks of you. Or caring enough about the right things," he said, "that the wrong things simply have less purchase." He looked at the middle distance. "She cares about the game. She cares about her father, clearly. She cares about accuracy, about the correct thing. She does not appear to care in any fundamental way about Mrs. Galverton's good opinion." A pause. "Because," he said, with the quality of a man arriving at a conclusion he had been approaching for some time, "Mrs. Galverton's good opinion is not worth caring about." I raised my glass. "No," I agreed. "It is not." Expanding Part 4. A fuller account of the WLLUGHBY ball. The Willoughby ball deserves more than I have given it, because it was the event at which everything became, for the first time, visible to the room. Before the Willoughby ball, what was happening between James and Miss Morrow was visible only to people who were watching closely. The attendance at the Royal Institution, the garden party maneuver, the Hookham's library incident, these were each small enough, and socially scattered enough, that they did not cohere into a narrative for anyone not paying specific attention. They were the kind of thing that, if someone had mentioned any single one of them, would have been met with polite interest and no particular significance. The Willoughby ball changed this. The Willoughby ball changed this because of the dance. Not just the fact of the dance, but the quality of it, which people who were watching, and many people were watching, could observe with their own eyes. James danced correctly at social events. He always had. He was technically accomplished, his position obligated him to be, and he performed the obligation without apparent effort. But correct dancing has a quality, and it is a particular quality, different from the quality of dancing with someone you are genuinely glad to be dancing with. The difference is subtle. Most people, observing from across a ballroom, would not be able to articulate it. But most people, observing from across a ballroom, could feel it. And what the people at the Willoughby ball felt, when they watched James Southerly dance with Miss Elspeth Morrow of Shropshire, was something different from what they had ever felt watching him dance with anyone else. This was noticed. It was noticed before Lady Alverston arrived at his elbow. I could see the noticing happening across the room, the quiet exchange of glances, the slight reorientation of conversational groups so that more of the group had a sightline to the dancers. London society is extremely sensitive to the difference between performed social behavior and genuine social engagement, because so much of what it deals in is the former, and so people in it develop a finely tuned sensor for the latter. What was being detected, across the Willoughby ballroom in the quality of James's dancing, was the genuine variety. And then Lady Alverston arrived, and said the Morrow girl, and James said, Miss Morrow, asterisk, and I watched the room process this exchange from every angle simultaneously, because the exchange was also not what anyone was accustomed to. The Duke of Harrowfield declining to agree with Lady Alverston's assessment of a social inferior was not a thing that happened. Lady Alverston's assessments were generally not declined. They were generally received, and agreed with, or occasionally politely redirected, but not simply contradicted by the offering of an alternative assessment drawn from personal experience. I have not found her out of her depth in any conversation I have had with her." That sentence traveled around the Willoughby ballroom at a speed that would have been impressive if it were not so thoroughly consistent with the general physics of the social world. And then James turned back to Miss Morrow and said something that made her look at him with the briefly startled expression and the faint private smile. And the assembled company of the Willoughby ball watched this happen and began the process of understanding that something had changed. After the exchange with Lady Alverston, I made my way toward a position closer to James and Miss Morrow, not because I intended to intervene, but because I wanted to observe more closely. What I observed was a conversation that had the quality, unusual in a ballroom setting, of mutual genuine interest. Not the performance of mutual interest, which is very common. The actual variety. They were talking about something I could not initially identify. I arrived mid-conversation, and I gathered, from the fragments I caught, that it was related to the lecture they had both attended at the Royal Institution. Miss Morrow was making a point about something, with her characteristic quality of careful precision, and James was listening in the way he listened when he was genuinely engaged. Not the polite attention of social courtesy, but the actual attention of a man who is following an argument and finds the argument interesting enough to want it completed before he responds. She finished the point. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that produced in her the expression I was increasingly familiar with. The slight surprise, followed by genuine engagement, followed by the response that was thought about rather than reflexive. This was not the performance of intellectual exchange. This was intellectual exchange. In a ballroom, at the Willoughby ball, which was not the venue at which intellectual exchange generally occurred. I retreated again, satisfied with what I had observed, and found Miss Pemberton standing nearby with an expression of such carefully suppressed delight that it was almost more expressive than delight itself would have been. "I believe," she said to me very quietly, "that something rather remarkable is happening." "I believe," I said with equal quietness, "that it has been happening for some weeks. It is simply more visible this evening." "Is it?" She stopped herself, apparently reconsidering the question she had been about to ask. "I believe it is," I said, because I could hear the question she had not asked. "For both of them." Miss Pemberton nodded slowly, with the expression of a woman who is very glad to be witnessing something and very conscious of the privilege. Expanding Part 5, James's interiority further. I want to return to the interior landscape, because I said things about it earlier that were true but incomplete. The thing that I did not say, because I had not yet fully articulated it to myself at the time, was this. James had not previously understood that what was missing from his life was this. The specific thing, the conversation that was genuinely mutual, the company that was genuinely interesting rather than performed, the honesty that was simply constant, like the air, unremarkable only because it was always there. He had understood that he was tired. He had understood that the season and the social obligations of his position and the particular performance of being the Duke of Harrowfield had become a labor that was sustained by duty rather than animated by any actual interest. He had understood this and had accepted it as the condition of his position, because the condition of his position was something he took seriously and did not look to improve by complaint. What he had not understood, until the watercolor exhibition and the Thursday dinners and the progressive accumulation of small observations over 6 weeks, was that the tiredness was not simply the natural result of 16 years of social obligation. It was the result of 16 years of surfaces, of engagement that was always performed, always strategic, always filtered through the machinery of social advantage and social calculation. Of rooms full of people who were very good at performing and entirely unknown underneath the performance. He had lived in a world of performances for so long that he had come to believe, without quite realizing he believed it, that the performance was what people were, that the social self was the real self, that the calculation was the character, that what you saw in drawing rooms and ballrooms was all there was to see. Miss Morrow had revealed this belief to him, not by arguing against it, but simply by not conforming to it. She was not performing. She was simply there, with all the specificity and consistency and unpredictability of an actual person. And in being simply there, she had, without intending to, demonstrated to James that the world did not only contain performances. This was, for a man who had been navigating performances for 16 years, a genuinely disorienting discovery. And what made it specifically significant, rather than merely interesting, was what he found when he looked at the reality underneath the performance. He found that it was exactly the kind of reality he would have chosen if the choosing had been available to him, which he had not previously understood it was. He had not known he wanted honesty of this specific kind. He had not known he wanted the card-playing quality of mind, or the observations about refraction, or the wry private amusement at minor adversity, or the insistence on promissory notes, or the direct and uncomfortable question asked because it needed to be asked. He had not known he was missing any of these things because he had not known, before he encountered them, that they existed in the form he was now encountering them. And then, having encountered them, he could not unencounter them. This is the nature of certain discoveries. They make the world permanently different by introducing a category that was not previously available. After encountering a constable, you cannot look at landscape painting the same way. After meeting a person of genuinely extraordinary character, you cannot evaluate character the same way. The standard has been reset. What was previously adequate has been revealed as insufficient. James, at the opening of the season of 1843, had not known that he found the social world insufficient. By the middle of that season, he knew it completely. And he knew, with equal completeness, what he had found that the social world was insufficient by contrast with. On one of the Thursday evenings in late July, we were nearly through the dinner and the conversation had wandered, which it sometimes did, which was one of the pleasures of it, when James said something that I want to record carefully. He said, "I have been reading more in the evenings." This was, in itself, unremarkable. James had always read extensively, but there was a quality in the observation that made me look at him more carefully. "What are you reading?" I asked. "Whatever seems interesting," he said. "The natural philosophy text she mentioned at the lecture, Some Philosophy of Mind. A volume on Shropshire geology that I had never previously had reason to open." A pause. "Shropshire geology," I said. "It seemed relevant," he said, without any apparent consciousness of how this sounded. I set down my glass. "James," I said. He looked at me with the expression of a man who knows exactly what the other person is about to say, and is considering, without urgency, whether to allow them to say it. "You are reading Shropshire geology," I said, "because it is the county she comes from and you want to have more to say." A pause. "It is an interesting county, geologically speaking," he said. "James, there are some significant limestone formations," he said, still perfectly composed, "and the glaciation patterns are." "James." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Yes. That is why I am reading it." I looked at him across the table, and I felt, not for the first time that season, but with more clarity than before, the specific quality of what was happening. Because James Sutherly, who had been the Duke of Harrowfield for 16 years, and who had read everything he had ever wanted to read, and had never, not once, read anything because of what it might give him to say to another person, James was reading Shropshire geology. "You are in very deep," I said. He looked at his glass. "Yes," he said quietly. "I believe I am." Expanding Part 6, the period after A.L. Macy case. The weeks between Almack's and Ravenswood Park were the most difficult of the season for Miss Morrow, and I want to record this accurately because it matters to the shape of what came after. The Almack's waltz had made what was happening visible in a way that even the Willoughby ball, with Lady Alverston's exchange and James's correction of it, had not quite achieved. The Willoughby ball could have been explained, by those who wished to explain it away, as the Duke being unusually attentive at a single event for reasons not necessarily significant. The waltz at Almack's was not explainable away. The waltz at Almack's was a statement, and everyone present understood it as a statement, and the social world had to decide what to do with the statement. What it decided to do, in the main, was resist. The resistance took several forms. The most obvious was the increasing frequency and increasing openness of the whispers. They had been present since the Willoughby ball, but after Almack's they became louder and less careful to be deniable. Women who had previously expressed their doubts in the careful indirect register of the not quite said began to say things more directly in smaller groups at events that were less exposed. Mrs. Galverton had a position, as I have noted, and expressed it with increasing confidence. Lady Alverston expressed her concern for the family name to James's face, which was a step beyond anything she had attempted at the Willoughby ball. Several families with daughters discontinued invitations to Miss Morrow, which was within their social prerogative, but which had the effect of narrowing the events she could attend. But the most difficult form of the resistance, I thought, was not any of these overtly hostile manifestations. The most difficult form was the specific quality of social isolation that surrounded her in the rooms she did attend. She was present. She was there. She was not excluded or actively shunned. That would have been too obvious, too easily characterized as cruelty. She was simply surrounded by a quality of not quite relating that was the social equivalent of a cold room. Not frozen, but comfortless. And she managed it. That is the word I keep returning to. She managed it. With the straightening and the continuing and the refusal to perform distress and the refusal to pretend it wasn't landing. Every evening she attended, she was entirely herself, and entirely managing, and the combination of these two things, being entirely herself and having to manage it simultaneously, was the specific difficulty that the weeks after Almack's produced. I saw her at a concert in the middle of August, sitting beside Mrs. Morrow in a way that was different from how she had been sitting at events earlier in the season. The posture was the same, correct, natural, easy. But there was something in the angle of her head, in the quality of her stillness, that told me she was not hearing the music particularly. She was elsewhere, somewhere interior, doing whatever she did when she needed to collect herself. I watched her collect herself. It took perhaps 5 minutes. And then she came back and leaned toward her mother and said something that made Mrs. Morrow smile and listened to the second movement with her characteristic quality of genuine attention. She was extraordinary, and she had no idea that I was watching, or that what I was watching was extraordinary, because she was simply doing what was necessary and had, I think, lost any distance from which to assess whether what was necessary was more than most people would have managed. Mrs. Morrow called on me during those weeks. She came to my rooms in the afternoon, a small, tidy woman in a good but aging gown, holding her reticule in the way she had held it at Lady Ashworth's luncheon months ago, with the specific tension of a woman who is very carefully managing her anxiety. She wanted to know, she said, whether I thought the Duke was serious. I had already told her that I believed he was serious. I had said this clearly at Half Moon Street when I had come to arrange the call. But she had come to ask again, which told me that the answer she needed was not just the answer but the reassurance behind it. The reassurance that this was not, in fact, the specific social disaster she had most feared. The disaster in which a powerful man develops what he believes to be genuine interest in her daughter, creates in the process a social exposure that makes other prospects impossible, and then, for whatever reason, does not follow through. This was the disaster she was afraid of, and it was, I should say, a reasonable fear. It was not an impossible scenario. Men of James's position occasionally did exactly this, not deliberately, not with any intention of harm, simply because the architecture of their social lives allowed certain kinds of interest without the full cost of certain kinds of commitment. And Miss Morrow in this scenario would have been left not merely unmarried but thoroughly exposed. The girl who had been noticed by the richest duke in England and found, upon closer acquaintance, insufficient. Which was the worst possible version of what the season could produce. "He is serious," I said again. "I am as certain of this as I have been of anything in 30 years of knowing him." She looked at me. "She is afraid," she said. "Elspeth. She doesn't say this to me. She wouldn't. She never says things that will make me worry more than I am already worrying. But I can see it." "She is," I said. "Appropriately so. It is a great deal to trust." "Yes," said Mrs. Morrow. "It is." A pause. "She trusts very carefully, Elspeth does. She always has. Even as a small girl, she would watch a person for a very long time before she would give them what they were asking for, not from coldness, from a sense of what things were worth." "I know," I said. "And she has been watching him," said Mrs. Morrow. "All season, I can see it." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you know what she told me? After the evening at the Willoughby ball, after the thing with Lady Alverston." "What did she tell you?" "She said," said Mrs. Morrow, "that he had said her name, where the other woman had said the other thing, and that she found this," she used this word, "she found it significant asterisk." A pause. "Elspeth does not use words loosely. If she says significant, she means it." "She is right," I said. "It was significant." Mrs. Morrow was quiet for a long time, and then she said, very quietly, "He had better be who she thinks he is." "He is," I said. "He is better than she thinks he is in some ways. He is not as good as she thinks he is in others. He is a real man, and she will find this out, and it will be all right." "You are very certain?" "I am," I said. "I have been watching him for 30 years. I know what he is." She looked at me and nodded slowly and stood to leave. At the door she paused and said, "Thank you for all of it." I said that I had done very little, which was approximately true in terms of direct action and entirely false in terms of everything else. Expanding Part 7, Ravenswood Park in fuller detail. I have given the account of Ravenswood Park in compressed form, and I want to expand it, because the 3 days at Ravenswood Park were the decisive period, and the decisive period deserves the full account. Lord Ravenswood was a man I liked, a straightforward landowner of good character and moderate intelligence, who had married a woman of considerably greater intelligence, and had the good sense to recognize this and to govern his household accordingly. Lady Ravenswood was the kind of hostess who thinks carefully about who to put together and who to keep apart, and she had clearly thought very carefully about this house party. The result was a gathering that had about it a quality of social balance that was not the default setting of London society, and that I found, arriving at Ravenswood Park, pleasantly surprising. James and I arrived in the late afternoon of the first day, when the other guests were already established, and the house had settled into its country weekend quality. The specific combination of formality and ease that the best country house parties produce, where the obligations are real but the form of them is lighter than in town. Miss Morrow and Mrs. Morrow had arrived earlier in the day, I learned. I found Miss Morrow in the garden before dinner, with Miss Pemberton and an older lady I identified as Lady Ravenswood's mother-in-law. A woman of 90, alert and formidably opinionated, who had apparently taken an immediate liking to Miss Morrow on the basis, I gathered from Miss Pemberton's subsequent account, of a conversation about card-playing that had led to an impromptu demonstration in the garden of Ravenswood Park that afternoon. Lady Ravenswood's mother-in-law, I was told, had declared Miss Morrow to be the first young woman of sense she had encountered in 7 years of London seasons, and had extended this assessment to include a rather pointed commentary on the standards of the current generation that had apparently been highly entertaining to everyone within earshot. Miss Morrow had apparently received this endorsement with the same composure she received everything, and had then beaten the old lady at cards, which had produced a shout of delight from the 90-year-old that could apparently be heard from the rose garden. When I found her before dinner, she was engaged in serious conversation with the old lady about the proper strategy for a particular card situation, and the quality of the engagement on both sides was, characteristically, entirely genuine. Not the performance of interest in an elderly person. Actual intellectual engagement with an actual person, whose age was simply one of her attributes rather than the defining fact of the interaction. This, I had learned over the course of the season, was how Miss Morrow engaged with everyone. With the actual person, whoever they were, at whatever level of social significance the assembled company assigned them. I found this, as the season progressed, increasingly remarkable. The first full day at Ravenswood, the Saturday, was the day of the conversation at the lake, which I have described already. But I want to add to that account the specific quality of what I observed, because the description I have given is accurate but compressed. I had positioned myself on the adjacent bench and was attending, as I said, with apparent interest to the lake. In fact, I was attending with considerable interest to the conversation happening some 20 yards from me, which I could not quite hear, but which I could observe with the quality of attention I had spent 50 years developing. What I observed in those 45 minutes was a conversation proceeding through several distinct phases. The first phase was careful, not quite stilted. They had enough established connection by this point to avoid stiltedness, but careful in the way of two people who are aware that what they are saying has implications, and are being deliberate about those implications without being quite ready to name them explicitly. There was quality conversation about real subjects, but there was also a quality of careful management of the distance between the two people having it. The second phase, which arrived perhaps 15 minutes in, was when the carefulness relaxed. I could see it relax, a quality of ease that arrived in the posture of both of them, almost simultaneously, as though they had each been doing something effortful and had, by some implicit mutual agreement, decided to stop doing it. The third phase was when what they were actually saying began to be visible in how they were saying it. I could not hear the words, but I could observe the rhythms. The moments when one of them said something and the other responded with genuine animation rather than social engagement. The moments when both of them were quiet and the quiet was comfortable. This was the one I noted particularly, when she said something and looked away toward the lake and he went very still before he answered. And the stillness was the stillness of a man who has just been told something that matters to him and is receiving it carefully. What he said in reply made her turn back to him with the expression I recognized. Direct, unguarded, precisely focused. Not the composed surface she maintained with most people, but the thing underneath the surface allowed to be present. She nodded slowly, the way one nods when something has been said that one has been waiting, without knowing it, for. And afterward they were quiet together for a while, and the quietness had a quality I had not observed in either of them before. The quality of two people who have arrived, by very different routes and at some cost, at the same place. When they returned to the house, she was walking beside him, not behind him. Beside him with the naturalness of someone who has decided, quietly and without ceremony, to simply be where they are. The Sunday evening, the third day, the evening of the party, I want to describe in its full sequence because the sequence matters. The morning had been fine, and we had walked in the grounds. The afternoon had been overcast, and several of the party had withdrawn indoors. I had spent the afternoon in the library, the actual use of the library, reading a genuinely interesting volume on the geology of the Shropshire uplands, which I had been moved to read by a conversation at dinner the previous evening that had touched on the subject. I was aware in the library that James had been in and out of it during the afternoon, and I was aware, in the way that one is aware of certain things when one is paying attention, that Miss Morrow had also spent time in the library. I do not know what they said to each other in the afternoon, in the library or elsewhere. I was not present for those conversations. What I know is what I observed at the evening party, that both of them had a quality of stillness that was different from their earlier stillness, a quality of having arrived somewhere that was less provisional than where they had been. And then Miss Denborough's group formed in the corner before the dancing, and the things were said, and I watched the whole sequence that I have already described. The arrest in Miss Morrow's movement, the straightening, the different quality of the cost this time, and then James's face as he registered it, and then the decision forming, and the wait, and the crossing. And the confrontation that was not a confrontation, simply a quiet and unambiguous withdrawal of the social cover that Miss Denborough had been relying on, and then the offer of the dance. What I have not conveyed adequately, I think, is the specific quality of the moment when she accepted. She paused before she answered, not long, perhaps 2 seconds. But in those 2 seconds I could see, from across the room, a series of things happening very rapidly in her. The registering of what was being offered, which was not merely a dance but a public statement. The assessing of what accepting meant, which was to become part of the statement. The weighing of the costs, which had been substantial this season, and which accepting would not reduce. And then, underneath all of this, something that was not calculation at all. Something that was simply her answer, arrived at from the level of what she actually wanted, rather than what was strategically correct. She said yes, and the music formed, and they danced, and I stood at the edge of the room and felt, for the first time since all of this had begun, something that I can only describe as the specific relief that comes when something that should have happened finally happens. Expanding the epilogue, the years that followed. I have given the epilogue in brief, and I want to expand it because the years are as much the story as the season. They had, by most accounts I can assemble, an exceptionally good marriage. This requires some qualification, because the word *good is deployed too broadly and too casually in these contexts. I do not mean good in the sense of socially appropriate, or financially advantageous, or free of difficulty, or smooth in its operation. I mean good in the deeper sense, the sense in which a marriage is good when the people in it are genuinely better and more fully themselves in it than they would be outside it. James was better in it. This was apparent to me within the first year and became more apparent with each year that followed. He was still James, still the quality of attention, still the cold precision, still the frightening quality that made people adjust their behavior in rooms when he entered them. These things did not change. They were constitutional, not situational. But there was a quality of animation in him that I had not previously observed. He laughed more, not frequently. He was not a man who laughed frequently, but more than before and with the genuineness that his laughter always had, and that made it, when it came, worth a great deal. He read with more pleasure. He was more interested in things generally, with a broader quality of attention, less confined to the practical and the immediate. He argued with her. This was the thing I found most striking when I visited them. James had not, in 30 years of my acquaintance, argued with anyone in the way he argued with Elspeth, the real variety of argument, where both parties have positions derived from actual thinking, and are engaged with each other's positions rather than performing the social exchange that passes for argument in most drawing rooms. They argued about books, about philosophy, about the correct management of the Harrowfield estates, about the geology of the uplands and the proper design of a kitchen garden, and whether a particular claret was better at 8 years or 12, and what the evidence actually showed about the lecture they had both attended, and whether the evidence was sufficient for the conclusion the lecturer had drawn. He listened to her in these arguments, really listened, in the way he almost never listened to anyone else, the specific quality of attention that is looking for what is actually being said rather than how to respond to what is being said. And she challenged him in the arguments in the way that required courage, direct challenges, based on the actual merits of the case, not the social management of disagreement, but the intellectual engagement with it. He loved this. He loved it so much, and so evidently, that I occasionally found it difficult to look at without feeling something that I can only describe as the specific envy of a man who has had good things in his life, and knows that this particular good thing is not among them, and is glad for his friend without being entirely able to avoid the awareness of the difference. Elspeth was better in it too, in the specific way that a person is better when the management that has been necessary finally becomes unnecessary. She had been managing, as I have said, for a long time, since her father's death, which left her the most capable person in the household, and therefore the one who held things together, since the season, which had required the specific labor of maintaining herself intact under conditions designed to make this difficult. She had managed it all with great skill and at considerable cost, and what marriage to James gave her was, among other things, the end of the necessity of managing at quite that level. Not that her life became without difficulty. It did not. The management of a ducal household of Harrowfield's scale was substantial work, and she engaged with it with the same quality of concentrated attention she had always brought to things she considered important. There were difficulties in the marriage, as there are difficulties in all marriages. There were seasons of strain and seasons of ease, and the ordinary rhythms of two people building a shared life over 40 years. But the management was not the defensive management of someone protecting themselves from a hostile social environment. It was the engaged management of someone running something that mattered to them. The difference is enormous. One depletes you and one sustains you, and Elspeth moved from the depleting to the sustaining in the first year of the marriage and never looked back. She straightened her posture less often, or rather, she straightened it when it was warranted, which is not quite the same thing as straightening it as a defensive mechanism. There were still evenings when someone at dinner said something unkind. She had not, by marrying the Duke of Harrowfield, moved into a world without unkind people, merely into a world where the unkind people had less power over her outcomes. And on those evenings, she would straighten her posture and catch James's eye and know that the conversation about the dinner party afterward would be more interesting than the dinner party itself. This is, in my view, approximately the best thing a marriage can offer, the specific pleasure of someone to talk to afterward who understood what you were looking at. The last thing. I want to end with something small. When I visited Harrowfield in the autumn of the year after the season, there was a moment, late in the afternoon before dinner, when the light was moving golden across the lawns of the estate, and I had gone to find a book in the library when I saw them through the window. They were in the garden, not doing anything particular. James was standing near one of the old stone walls, looking at something in the middle distance. Elspeth was a few yards from him, examining something in one of the flower beds with the quality of concentrated interest she brought to everything she examined. They were not talking. They were not interacting in any visible sense. But they were together, in the specific way that two people are together when they are not quite adjacent and not quite separate. when the space between them is comfortable and known, when each person's awareness of the other is simply a feature of the landscape rather than something that requires management or performance. I watched them for perhaps 2 minutes, and then Elspeth looked up from the flower bed, not toward me. I was invisible behind the library window, but toward James. She said something. He turned, said something back. She laughed, a real laugh, brief and private, shared with no one but him. He smiled. I have told you already that James's smile was not a social smile. When it came, it was genuine, and when it was genuine, it was very particular. A quality of the whole face that was rare enough that you marked it each time you saw it and remembered it afterward. I marked it. I turned away from the window and found the book I had come for, and went to sit by the fire in the small reading room, and felt, as I had felt on various occasions over the course of that extraordinary season, and in the years since, the specific quality of gratitude that comes when the things that should happen actually happen. It does not always, that is the thing. The machinery of the social world grinds on with its impersonal efficiency, and the Elspeth Morrows are classified as nobody and treated accordingly, and the James Sutherleys spend their 16 years in a world of surfaces and learn to mistake the surface for the whole of the thing, and the two of them never find each other. That is what usually happens. But in the season of 1843, it did not happen that way. In the season of 1843, a man who had stopped being surprised by anything found himself standing before a watercolor in a corner, explaining why it was the best thing in the room, beside a woman who had already noticed it. And everything that followed from that. She was never nobody. She was the person who noticed the Cotman. And he was the man who, having spent 41 years learning to see clearly, finally looked in the right direction at the right moment. That in the end is all it was, and that in the end was everything. End. Story log update, entry 11 asterisk. 11/20/20/60727. He was the richest duke in England, she was nobody. And he made her his everything and the duke's closest friend male, ruined family daughter/debtor's daughter Elspeth Morrow, Shropshire 21, called nobody, the Morrow girl/provincial girl, mocked as unfit at every season event, the richest duke in England, James Aldrich Sutherley, 9th Duke of Harrowfield. Invented, Hardington Ball/Mrs. Galverton's card party/Mrs. Thornfield's watercolor exhibition, Almack's/Willoughby Ball/Ravenswood Park house party. November wedding, chosen before a shocked society, the cruel humbled/library declaration at Ravenswood November wedding, sweeping vindication right arrow devotion quietly triumphant, no 180 min target, 33,300 words. Film seed, The Deceiver 1931, mood of hidden worth unmasked before an audience. Title log update, entry 11 asterisk. 11/20/20/60727. He was the richest duke in England, she was nobody. And he made her his everything a ruined family daughter called nobody, and the Morrow girl by society he chose her publicly, the waltz at Almack's, the confrontation at Ravenswood, the library declaration, the November wedding, the cruel humbled, society revised none he entry 11. A1 DNA last used entry 1, 10 entries prior. Opening word, he knew. Ducal epithet, the richest duke/Harrowfield knew. Heroine framing, ruined family/debtor's daughter knew. Hash further expansion, additional scenes and depth. Hash on Mrs. Galverton's card party, the full evening. I want to go back to Mrs. Galverton's card party and give it the full account it deserves, because it was the first evening in which I observed James observing her, and the quality of that observation, the specific attention he was paying, and what it communicated about the state of him at that moment, is important to the record. The party began at 8. I arrived at 1:15, which was the appropriate interval, early enough to be present for the early circulation, late enough not to seem eager. James arrived some minutes after me, which was characteristic. He timed his arrivals at events with the precision of a man who has calculated the social mathematics of lateness and earliness, and arrived at a settled position on the optimal interval. The room was arranged as these rooms always are, the card tables positioned to take advantage of the light, the non-playing guests circulating in the spaces between, the refreshments at one end, the fireplace at the other providing the room's natural gravity. Mrs. Galverton was at the center of this arrangement in the way that good hostesses are at the center, not physically occupying the center, but socially constituting it, so that the room oriented around her position the way a room orients around a fire. I made my initial circuit, exchanged the appropriate pleasantries with the appropriate people, and then found a position from which I could observe the card table without appearing to be observing it. This position happened to be adjacent to a group discussing the literary merits of a recent novel, a discussion I could participate in with sufficient engagement to be present without monopolizing my attention. Miss Morrow had been at the card table since before my arrival. I gathered from the state of play when I first had a clear view of it. She and Colonel Forthby were approximately one hand ahead of where they had started, which meant they were doing well. The Colonel was a sound player but not exceptional, and the differential suggested that Miss Morrow's contribution to the partnership was positive. She played with a quality that I want to describe more precisely, because the quality of play is revealing of character in ways that the social world does not always recognize. Most card players in social settings are playing in what I might call the diplomatic register. They are attending to the game with some portion of their attention and to the social situation with the remainder, and the weighting shifts depending on the situation. If the social stakes are high, if the partner or opponent is someone whose opinion matters, more attention goes to the social. If the social stakes are low, more goes to the cards. This produces play that is competent but not consistent, that rises and falls according to the social temperature of the room. Miss Morrow appeared to play in a different register entirely. She played, as I have said, the cards themselves. Her attention to the social situation was not absent. She was not rude, not inattentive to her companions, not dismissive of the conversational dimension of the game. But her attention to the cards was primary and consistent, undisturbed by the social temperature of the room. The result was that her play was consistent in a way that social card playing is generally not. The same quality of attention to the first hand as to the fourth, the same careful assessment of the situation before each decision. Colonel Forthby, who was a serious player despite his limited conversational range, had noticed this. I could see it in the way he watched her during her hands, the specific quality of a man watching another player and assessing what kind of player they are. He was, I thought, concluding that she was a better player than anyone present had anticipated. The hand that preceded the Mrs. Galverton incident was a particularly interesting one. I had been watching closely enough to follow the play, and what Miss Morrow did in that hand was the kind of thing that experienced players recognize as the mark of a particular quality of mind. She played for the outcome of the whole hand rather than the safety of the individual trick, sacrificing a position of safety early in order to create a position of strength late. The move was slightly risky. It required a specific distribution in the opponent's hands that she had inferred rather than known, and it worked. And the result was not just the winning of the hand, but the winning of it by a more substantial margin than any straightforwardly safe approach would have produced. Colonel Forthby made a sound that was not quite an expression and not quite a question, acknowledging what he had just watched. Miss Morrow said nothing. She simply collected the tricks with the same composure she had played the hand with. And then Mrs. Galverton arrived. I have given the account of what followed already, but I want to add the specific quality of the silence that preceded Miss Morrow's answer. It was not a long silence, a second, perhaps, no more. But it was the specific silence of someone who has heard a question and is choosing not the first available answer but the correct one. The correct one required a moment to identify, not because it was complicated, but because it was completely honest, and honesty sometimes requires a moment of selection, the identification of precisely what is true among the various true things available. She identified it, my father taught me. And then she gave it. And then, because honesty is consistent, the follow-up. He died 3 years ago. I find the game a pleasant way to keep his company when I miss it. This was not calculated to produce sympathy. I want to be very clear about this because it is crucial to understanding who she was. There is a kind of deployment of grief, skilled, practiced, often effective, in which the mention of a lost parent is used to redirect a social situation in one's favor, to create a current of sympathy that smooths away difficulties. This technique is well understood in drawing rooms and is used with varying degrees of subtlety by people who have learned it. Miss Morrow was not using it. She was answering the question that had been asked. Mrs. Galverton had asked who had taught her. The answer was her father. The further fact about her father, that he had died 3 years ago and that she missed him, and that the card game had become a way of keeping his company, was not a calculated addition designed to produce a specific social effect. It was the rest of the truth, offered because the truth does not generally come in pieces when you are in the habit of giving it whole. The effect it produced, the small arrest of Mrs. Galverton's social machinery, the slight deflation of the condescension, was not the intended effect. It was simply the natural consequence of a true answer being given in a context that had been structured to receive a performed one. Mrs. Galverton was too experienced to allow this to show on her face, but the withdrawal was real. She had planned to do something and had found that it cost more than she had budgeted, and so she did not do it, and that was the end of the encounter. And across the room, James was watching. The Thursday dinner, at which James spoke of her for the first time at length. There was a particular Thursday dinner, perhaps 3 weeks after the card party, that I want to record because it was the occasion on which James spoke of her at length for the first time, and what he said reveals something important. We had eaten well and were into the port, and James had been in one of his directed, quiet moods that I had learned to wait out without prompting. The waiting sometimes produced nothing. The waiting sometimes produced something very specific. This time it produced something I had not heard from him before. He said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly." "I generally answer you honestly," I said. "Yes," he said, "I know. That is why I am asking you." A pause. "Do you think that she is unhappy?" I considered this carefully because it was not a simple question and it deserved a careful answer. "I think," I said, "that she is navigating a difficult situation with great skill and that the skill required to navigate it is costing her something. Whether that constitutes unhappiness, I could not say with certainty. She does not appear miserable. She appears managing." "Managing is not the same as happy," he said. "No," I said, "it is not." He was quiet. "The managing concerns me," he said. "Not the managing itself, the managing is impressive, but the cost of it. The season is designed, I have been observing, to be particularly difficult for someone in her position, not designed deliberately. Simply, the particular combination of circumstances produces a specific kind of difficulty. She is present at events where she has legitimate reason to be present, and where the majority of the other people present have decided, without real basis, that her presence is not quite the thing, and she has to navigate this daily. The individual events are small. The cumulation is not small." "No," I said, "the cumulation is not small." "And she navigates it," he said, "without complaint, without performing distress, without performing anything." A pause. "This is what concerns me," he said. "Not the difficulty of the situation. The fact that she manages the difficulty in a way that gives no one, including me, clear evidence of how much it is costing. Which means that she is protecting everyone else from having to see what the season is doing to her." He looked at his glass. "That is not," he said, "a small burden to carry." I thought about the concert and the quality of stillness I had observed in Miss Morrow that evening, the interior recollecting, the bringing of herself back to the present moment, the return to engagement. I thought about Mrs. Morrow visiting me with the question she needed to ask again. I thought about the straightening of the posture and the way the straightening was not flinching, but was also not nothing. "No," I said, "it is not a small burden." James was quiet for a long time, and then he said something that surprised me, not in its content but in its directness. "I want," he said, "to be the person she does not have to protect from seeing it." I looked at him across the table. "I mean," he said, "that I would rather she did not have to manage the cost in my company, that when she is with me the cost can simply be what it is, without the managing. I want," he stopped, found the sentence again. "I want her to be able to simply be where she is." I thought about what he had just said. It was, in its way, the most specific thing he had said to me about her, and it was more specific than the kind of thing men of his type generally said in such contexts. It was not about what he wanted from her. It was about what he wanted for her. "Yes," I said. "I believe that is what she needs." "I believe," he said, "that it is what I wish to offer." A pause. "Which requires," he said, "that she trust me enough to allow it." "Which requires," I said, "that you give her reason to." He nodded, very slowly. The nod of a man who has arrived at a conclusion that is both clear and demanding, and who has assessed the demand and decided to meet it. Hash on the nature of what James was and why it mattered. I want to say something here about the specific quality of James Sutherly's character that made him the right person to see what he saw in Elspeth Morrow, because it was not accidental. A different man, in his position, looking at the same season, would not have seen it. James had several qualities that were relevant. The first was his particular relationship to accuracy. He cared about accuracy in a way that was, in the social world he inhabited, genuinely unusual. Most people in that world cared about plausibility, about the appearance of being correct, about the version of events that would be accepted as correct, about the social consensus regarding what was real. James cared about what was actually real. He found plausibility without accuracy deeply unsatisfying in a way that manifested as a kind of restlessness, a quality of not quite settled that he could not resolve by simply accepting the plausible version. He needed the accurate version. When something was being described incorrectly, even in small ways, even in ways that had no practical consequence, he experienced a specific discomfort that he could not entirely suppress. This quality made him very good at his responsibilities, the management of the Harrowfield estates, the legal and financial decisions that governed the lives of hundreds of people, the negotiations that his position required him to conduct. It also made him, in social settings, somewhat difficult, because social settings are organized around plausibility rather than accuracy, and James's preference for the latter was a perpetual slight friction with the functioning of the former. In the case of Miss Morrow, his preference for accuracy operated as follows. The social consensus was that she was nobody, that she was a sweet provincial girl who was out of her depth, that the Duke's attention was a kindness rather than a genuine interest, that the genuine interest, if it existed at all, was a confusion that would resolve itself. All of this was the plausible version, the version that fit the available categories and required no reclassification. James looked at the plausible version and found it inaccurate and could not accept the inaccuracy. The second relevant quality was his attention. I have described the quality of James's attention already, the complete, undeceived, frightening quality that made people adjust their behavior in rooms when he entered them. What I have not quite said is that this quality of attention was applied to everything equally. James did not have a hierarchy of things worthy of full attention and things worthy of partial attention. He applied the same quality of attention to a problem of estate management and to a hand of cards and to a conversation about the refraction of light. This meant that when he attended to a person, when he actually directed that attention at a person, rather than at the social surface the person was presenting, he saw them with a completeness that most people did not bring to the seeing. He had directed this attention at Elspeth Morrow, beginning at Mrs. Galverton's card party, and what he saw was what was actually there, which was considerably more than the social world's classification suggested. The third quality was his relationship to honesty, which I have touched on already but want to expand. James valued honesty not merely as a virtue but as a practical necessity. He found dishonesty in any form, social dishonesty, performed emotion, strategic management of impression, almost physically uncomfortable, in the way that some people are uncomfortable with noise. He could endure it because the world required it of him and he was a disciplined man. But he could not find it anything other than what it was, a kind of static that interfered with the actual signal. Miss Morrow was, for James, the absence of static, not because she was without social grace. She was, in fact, possessed of genuine social grace, the kind that comes from actually caring about the people around you rather than from strategic deployment of the appropriate behaviors. But because everything she did and said had the quality of the actual signal, undistorted. When she was amused, she was actually amused. When she answered a question, she answered it. When she was tired, the tiredness was there, visible to a careful observer, rather than smoothed away behind a social surface. This was, for James, extraordinary. He had not, in 16 years of the social season, encountered it with this consistency, in this form. He had encountered honesty. He had encountered character. He had encountered people whose social performance was sufficiently thin that the actual person occasionally showed through. But he had not encountered a person for whom the performance and the person were simply the same thing, for whom what you saw was what was there because the notion of presenting something different had apparently not occurred to her as an option. This was the discovery, not romance initially, not attraction though that came, but something more fundamental, the discovery that what he had assumed was simply the nature of people, the layering of performance over reality, was not universal. That there was another way to be in the world, that it was possible to simply be there. And once he had encountered this possibility in its specific embodiment, he could not unencounter it. The morning before the wedding. Miss Morrow asked him, on the morning of their wedding, whether he was certain he was not confused. I want to give this its full weight, because it is the final and most characteristic expression of who she was, and because it is in this expression that the whole of the season is concentrated. She asked him because she could not help asking, not because she doubted him. She had, I think, arrived at a settled conviction about his character that would not have been easy to dislodge. But because the question was the right question, and she asked right questions even when asking them was uncomfortable, even when asking them was slightly absurd, even on the morning of her wedding, when the moment for the question had, by most people's reckoning, passed. She asked because she was honest, and honesty was not something she performed only when it was convenient. It was simply how she operated, and it was not convenient on the morning of her wedding to ask the man she was about to marry whether he was confused, but it was honest. What I find most extraordinary about this is not the asking. It is what the asking tells you about the relationship between them. She could ask the question on the morning of their wedding because she understood, had understood since the library at Ravenswood, perhaps before, that he valued exactly this quality of her. That the asking was not a risk she was taking but a truth she was offering, and that the offering would be received as what it was rather than as what the social world would have made of it. She could ask because he was the person you could ask. And he could answer because she was the person you could answer honestly, without managing the answer, without softening it into plausibility, without offering the reassuring version rather than the accurate one. I have been certain since the library. That was the accurate version. He had been thinking about her since the card party. He had been reading Shropshire geology because of her. He had been sitting through dinners thinking about what she would say about them. He had been standing in front of watercolors and remembering the quality of her attention to the Cotman. He had been tracking the cost of the season on her face with the specific concern of a man who cares what is costing what and to whom. He had made the promissory note into something he carried. He had been certain since the library because the library was where he said it, but he had been certain before the library. He had been certain since approximately the card party or the watercolor exhibition, or the Thursday dinner when he mentioned the Shropshire geology. The library was simply the moment at which the certainty was spoken, and spoken to the right person, and received. She found that satisfactory. Of course she did. It was the accurate version. A note on what the story is about. I have been writing this account for some weeks now, setting it down in the evenings when the light is good and my eyesight, which is not what it was, still permits extended writing. I am 72 years old and I am writing about events that happened 30 years ago, and the question of why I am doing this has occurred to me on several evenings when I might have been reading instead. The answer I have arrived at is this. I am writing it because the story that circulates in polished company is not quite right, and not quite right versions of real things have always bothered me, for the same reason that they bothered James. The not quite right version is as follows. A great duke became interested in a girl who was nobody. The great duke, in the way of great dukes in stories, rescued her from obscurity and the ungrateful whispers of a cruel social world, and in doing so demonstrated his superior sensibility and her hidden worthiness, and they were married and the cruel were humbled. This is not quite wrong. The surface events conform to this account, but the account misses the substance of the thing, which is this. He did not rescue her. She did not need rescuing. She was managing the season with remarkable skill and would have continued to manage it even if James Sutherly had never existed. She was not waiting to be found or saved or elevated. She was simply living, carefully, honestly, with great determination in difficult circumstances. What James did was not rescue. What James did was see. He saw what she was with the quality of attention he brought to everything, and he refused, because he was constitutionally incapable of refusing to accept the inaccurate version of it that the social world was offering him. He saw her clearly, and finding what he found when he saw her clearly, he chose her. And she not rescued, not grateful, not overwhelmed by fortune. She looked at him with the same quality of careful, honest attention she brought to everything, and she asked the important question, and she received the accurate answer, and she chose him. That is the story, not a rescue. Two people, each of whom saw the other clearly and chose what they found. This happens less often than the stories suggest. When it happens, it is worth recording. Which is what I have tried to do. True end. Final production notes asterisk. Word count, words, 180 minutes times 185 WPM. All tracker updates logged above. Story Engine A has not been used since entry 1, 10 entries prior. All banned tropes, no. All hard rules satisfied. Hash final expansion, remaining SCNES. Hash the dinner ATRAVENSWOOD Park, first evening info. The first dinner at Ravenswood Park was a formal affair. 14 at table, the silver out, the wine from Lord Ravenswood's cellar, which was, by reputation, worth travelling to Buckinghamshire for. I was seated between Lady Ravenswood's mother-in-law, who had already formed her strong opinion of Miss Morrow and was in excellent spirits as a result, and a retired admiral of some conversational distinction. Miss Morrow was seated across the table and 2 places to my left, beside a gentleman I did not immediately recognize and across from Miss Pemberton, who had been placed with the skill of a hostess who understands where to position allies. The arrangement told me that Lady Ravenswood had read the situation clearly and was managing it with the intelligence I had attributed to her. James was at the far end of the table, near Lord Ravenswood. This, too, was deliberate. Lady Ravenswood was not trying to force anything. She was creating a situation in which things could develop at their own pace, which is the highest form of hospitality in these situations. The dinner unfolded as these dinners do. The soup, the fish, the meats, the removes, the dessert, the conversation flowing around and between the courses in the way it does when the company is genuinely well chosen and the food is genuinely good. I attended to the Admiral and to Lady Ravenswood's mother-in-law and to my food, and observed, with the peripheral attention I had developed over 50 years, the table at large. Miss Morrow was, as I have noted before, genuinely good at table conversation in the specific way that is rarer than it sounds. She did not deploy a social persona that worked across all situations. She was actually responsive to the specific people she was talking to, which means her conversation varied according to who she was talking with in the way that real conversation varies, but performed conversation does not. With the unknown gentleman on her left, who turned out to be a naturalist of some distinction, she was engaged in what appeared to be a genuine discussion about something I could not quite follow from my position, but that involved the natural history of the Buckinghamshire countryside. With Miss Pemberton, the conversation was warmer and easier, the conversation of 2 people who have established a genuine friendship and are comfortable in each other's company. What I observed, once during the soup and once again during the fish, was that she glanced briefly toward James's end of the table. Not longingly, not in any way that could be described as wistful or romantic. Simply checking, the way one checks the position of something important in a room, to confirm that it is where one expects it to be. He glanced toward her end of the table with approximately the same frequency and approximately the same quality. Not prolonged, not romantic in any visible sense. Simply checking. I noticed this, and found it, in its small ordinariness, more expressive than any number of more dramatic gestures could have been. Lady Ravenswood's mother-in-law, who was 90 and had been observing drawing rooms and dinner tables for 70 years of active social life, leaned toward me during the dessert and said, very quietly, "The Duke and the Morrow girl." "Yes," I said. "About time," she said. "He's been carrying himself like a man waiting for something specific for at least 6 years. Now he's found it." I looked at her. 6 years. "The look," she said. "When a man has stopped being interested in what's available and is waiting, not knowing he's waiting, mind you, the kind of waiting men do where they deny the waiting completely, for something specific. He's had that look for at least 6 years. I noticed it at Almack's, actually. Watched him dance with 4 perfectly appropriate women and look exactly as engaged as if he were signing documents." "He is a very controlled man," I said. "He is," she said, "but control doesn't produce that look. That look is the absence of interest pretending to be control." She helped herself to another spoonful of the syllabub. "The girl, on the other hand, is interesting. Has she always been?" "I believe so," I said, "though I have only known her since the season." "The card playing," she said. "I played 3 hands with her this afternoon. She plays to win, not to impress. There are not very many people who do that." "No," I said, "there are not." "Good," said the old lady, with the finality of a woman who has made a judgment and sees no reason to revise it. "She'll do." The morning after RAVNSWOOD, on the drive back to London. James and I drove back to London together on the 4th day, the way we had come, and the drive from Buckinghamshire to London takes approximately 4 hours depending on the condition of the roads, which on that particular August morning were in reasonable order. We talked for the first hour about the house party, as one does after house parties. The food, the company, the quality of the library, Lord Ravenswood's particular excellence as a host. We talked about the political news, which had accumulated during the 3 days of our absence. We talked about a legal matter concerning the Harrowfield mines that James had been carrying in the back of his mind, and had not yet resolved. In the second hour, James was quiet. I was not quiet in the way of a man who has nothing to say. He was quiet in the directed way that I knew well by now, the way of a man who has arrived at something, and is in the process of understanding exactly what he has arrived at. I let him be. In the third hour, somewhere between the last Buckinghamshire village and the beginning of the Middlesex flats, he said, "I am going to speak to her mother." I had known this was coming. I had known it since the stone bench by the lake, when she had nodded in the way one nods when something has been said that one has been waiting, without knowing it, to hear. But the knowing that it was coming and the hearing of it stated were different things. "Yes," I said. "I want to be certain," he said, "that I am doing this correctly." "What would correctly look like?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "It would look," he said carefully, "like making clear that what I want is her genuine regard and not her compliance, that the position has no bearing on the answer I am hoping for. That I am aware of the difference between a woman who accepts because the practical calculus points in that direction, and a woman who accepts because she has considered the person and the question, and has arrived at a genuine yes." "And if she arrives at a genuine no?" I asked. A pause. "Then I accept the genuine no," he said, "and I consider that I have had several months of better conversation than I have had in the preceding 16 years, and I consider that a sufficient thing even if it is not the whole of what I would have wished for." I looked at him. "You are quite certain you can do that?" "I believe so," he said. "The alternative, pressing for an acceptance that is not genuine, does not interest me. What would I do with an ungenuine yes? I would have the position filled and the actual thing absent. I have had the actual thing absent for 41 years. I am not persuaded that filling the position would improve the situation." This was, I thought, entirely characteristic. He had identified what he actually wanted with complete precision, not the form of the thing but the substance of it. And he was correct that the form without the substance would be of very limited value. "She will not give you an ungenuine answer," I said. "No," he said, "I know this about her." "Which is partly why you want this particular answer," I said. He looked at me, and there was something in his face that was close to the smile that was not quite a social smile. "Partly," he said. "Yes. The promissory note, what happened to it? This is a small thing, but I want to record it because small things of this kind contain the substance. 6 months after the wedding, I visited them at the Harrowfield townhouse for dinner. It was the usual Thursday dinner, translated from my rooms to theirs, which had required some negotiation, but which James had insisted on. The Thursday dinner was, he said, a fixture that should not be disrupted by a change of venue. After dinner, while Elspeth was attending to some household matter, the specific logistical attention that a large establishment requires, and that she was, I had already observed, excellent at James, and I sat in his study with the port, which was the usual territory for port in the Thursday tradition. The study was a room I had been in many times over the years. James's preferred private space in the townhouse, lined with books, with the quality of a room that is actually worked in rather than arranged for appearance. On one wall there was a case of small objects, the kind of display that some men make of things that matter to them, the specific memorabilia of a specific life. I looked at the case while James was pouring. It contained the usual variety of such things: a small medal from some civic occasion, a pocket watch that had been his father's, a piece of mineral sample from the Harrowfield mines, a cufflink that I knew had been lost, and then found on an occasion of some significance, a miniature portrait of his mother. And in the corner of the case, in a small silver frame of the kind used for visiting cards and small documents, the promissory note. Written in a clear, small hand on a page torn from a pocket book, for the exact amount, dated with the exact date, specifying the nature of the obligation. I looked at it for a moment, and James came back with the port, and I said nothing, and he said nothing, and we sat down with our glasses. But I thought about it for the rest of the evening, and I have thought about it since. Because the promissory note in the silver case, in the corner of James Southerly's study, is the most accurate possible summary of what had happened between them. A document produced by someone who took obligations seriously, received by someone who recognized what it represented, kept by someone who understood that it was not the debt that mattered but the person who had insisted on acknowledging it. He did not keep it as a trophy. He kept it as an accurate record of a specific moment in which he had seen, with complete clarity, who she was. It is still there, I believe. I have not visited Harrowfield since last autumn, but I have no reason to think it has been moved. Things that James Southerly decided to keep did not tend to move. On Miss Pemberton. I have not given sufficient account of Miss Pemberton, who deserves one. Miss Pemberton, her given name was Charlotte. She became Mrs. Withers some years later, was the daughter of a Berkshire baronet of the comfortable but undistinguished variety. She had come to the season with moderate expectations and moderate means, and the specific quality that I have always found most attractive in young women, the capacity for genuine warmth without social calculation. She was not beautiful in any conventional sense. She was possessed of good humor, good intelligence, and the kind of reliability that makes a person indispensable rather than spectacular. She had attached herself to Miss Morrow, or, more accurately, they had attached to each other, in the second week of the season, at a musical entertainment where they had found themselves seated beside each other, and had discovered, in the course of 2 Mozart arias and 1 Beethoven string quartet, that they had a great deal in common. What they had in common was this. They were both present at an event that was primarily a social exercise, and they were both, actually, interested in the music. This is less common than it should be. And when 2 people who are actually listening to music find each other in a room of people who are pretending to listen to music, there is a specific and immediate recognition. Miss Pemberton had, throughout the season, been a genuine friend to Miss Morrow. Not the strategic friendship of someone who sees social advantage in a particular connection. There was no social advantage, in the early weeks of the season, in being closely associated with Miss Morrow, but the genuine friendship of someone who liked who she was and wanted to spend time in her company. This was not nothing. I want to record it because the season of 1843, in the account that has come down through the years, tends to be told as a story of the Duke and the nobody, with everyone else as either backdrop or antagonist. But Miss Pemberton was neither. She was a person who saw clearly, early in the process, what a number of other people did not see until much later, and who acted on what she saw at some social cost to herself, because she was the kind of person who acted on what she saw. At the Willoughby ball, after the exchange with Lady Alverston, when James turned back to Miss Morrow and said whatever he said that produced the private smile, Miss Pemberton was standing nearby, and I caught her expression. She was not surprised. She was something closer to relieved, with the specific quality of relief that belongs to someone who has been watching something difficult and has finally seen it arrive at the point toward which it was always heading. She had seen it before I quite had. After the wedding announcement, Miss Pemberton wrote a letter to Miss Morrow, to the Duchess-to-be, that I was shown, some years later, by the Duchess herself. It was a short letter. It said several things, but the thing I remember most clearly was this. I always thought you were the best person in any room you entered. I am very glad that someone else has finally noticed. The Duchess kept the letter. I saw it in the same case as the promissory note, some visits later. On the nature of what she carried. I want to say something about the weight Miss Morrow was carrying, because I have described the external manifestations of it, the straightening, the composure, the managing, without quite conveying the interior reality that these manifestations were managing. She was 21 years old when she came to London for the season of 1843. She had been, for the preceding 4 years, the most capable person in her household, which meant, in practice, that she had been the one who held the household together, the practical decisions, the management of anxiety, the steady maintenance of something livable within the reduced circumstances. Her mother was kind and capable in certain ways, but she was not the kind of capable that the specific situation required. Elspeth was. She had done this without complaint, and without, apparently, giving much thought to whether it was appropriate for a 21-year-old to be operating in this way. It was simply what was necessary, and she did what was necessary, and she found, somewhere in the years of doing it, that she was also what was sufficient for it, which was its own particular education. The season, in this context, was a different kind of weight. It required not the management of known circumstances, but the navigation of an environment that was actively hostile in the specific, impersonal way I have described. And the navigation required not the practical capability she had developed over 4 years of managing the household, but something different, the psychological capacity to remain herself under sustained pressure to be otherwise. The pressure was not articulated. No one said to Miss Morrow, "Become someone else." No one said, "Stop being what you are and start being what we can process." The pressure was structural, the result of being in an environment that rewarded one set of qualities and was indifferent to or actively discouraging of another set. The rewarded set included performed deference, strategic social warmth, the specific behavioral signals that indicated gratitude for being present among one's betters. The unrewarded set included honesty of the variety that does not monitor itself for social convenience, genuine attention to what is actually in front of you rather than what you are supposed to be attending to. The refusal to inflate or deflate yourself according to the requirements of the moment. Miss Morrow possessed the unrewarded set. She was not in possession of the rewarded set, or rather she was in possession of certain elements of it. She was not without social grace, she was not rude, she was not incapable of the appropriate social behaviors. But she was not in possession of the performed variety, the strategic variety, the variety that is deployed as a tool for social advancement rather than expressed as a quality of genuine engagement with other people. And so the season rewarded her inadequately while being unclear about why. The assessment was that she was not quite the thing, and the reason for the assessment was never articulated, because the machinery does not articulate its reasons. It simply classifies and moves on. The classified person is left to infer the reason from the effects, which is a deeply uncertain business, and one that requires, in a person of sensitivity and genuine self-awareness, either a considerable retreat into defended certainty or a quality of ongoing openness to being wrong about oneself. Miss Morrow maintained the openness. This was, in some ways, more difficult than the defended certainty. The defended certainty, the decision to simply know oneself to be correct and the social world to be wrong, is a strategy with real protective value, and I have seen many people deploy it with some success. But it is also a strategy that cuts off information, that refuses to allow the social feedback to penetrate at all, and the result is a kind of social armor that protects at the cost of also insulating. Miss Morrow did not armor herself. She remained open to the information the season was offering, which meant that when the information was negative, and it frequently was, she had to process it rather than deflect it. She had to take in the whispers and the not-quite-said asides and the smoothly closed conversational groups and the barely there acknowledgments, and she had to assess whether they were telling her something accurate about herself or something inaccurate about the world. And she had to do this assessment quickly, in the moment, without the luxury of extended reflection, and she had to maintain her functioning regardless of the conclusion. This is a great deal to ask of a 21-year-old person, navigating her first London season with limited resources and no established allies. She did it, brilliantly in fact, by any honest measure. She did it with a quality that I found, the longer I watched it, approaching something I could only call moral courage. The courage not of dramatic action but of daily maintenance, of continuing to be exactly who you are in a context that would very much prefer you to be something more manageable. And underneath this daily maintenance, underneath the composure and the straightening and the continuing of conversations and the returning of attention to card games and the answering of questions with true answers, underneath all of this, as I have said, was the cost, the accumulation, the weight of it. What James offered her in the library at Ravenswood Park was not rescue from this weight. He was not in a position to remove it retroactively. It had already been carried, and that was already true. What he offered was the end of carrying it alone. Not immunity from future difficulty, he was honest about this, which was characteristic and important, but the sharing of whatever came after. You will not track the costs alone. For someone who had been tracking costs alone for 4 years, since her father's death which had initiated the tracking, this was not a small thing. It was, in fact, quite specifically the thing she needed. Not a solution, not a rescue, a partner in the actual enterprise of living. Which is what he was for the 40 years that followed. End of all expansions. Complete story log update, asterisk. Entry 11, 2026-0727. He was the richest duke in England, she was nobody. And he made her his everything engine A dismissed chosen narrator. The duke's closest friend, male heroine, ruined family daughter Elspeth Morrow of Shropshire, 21 trigger, called nobody. The Morrow girl / provincial girl, the duke. James Aldrich Sutherly, 9th Duke of Harrowfield, invented setting. London season 1843. Hartington Ball, Mrs. Galverton's card party, Mrs. Thornfield's watercolor exhibition, Royal Institution lecture, Lady Whitmore's garden party, Hookham's library, Willoughby Ball, Almack's, Ravenswood Park house party, November wedding, Harrowfield estate ending. Chosen before shocked society / library declaration, November wedding mood, sweeping vindication, right arrow devotion, quietly triumphant band trope. No notes, 180 min target. Film Seed the Deceiver, 1931, mood only. Complete title log update, asterisk. Entry 11, 2026-0727. He was the richest duke in England, she was nobody, and he made her his everything DNA. A1 mocked as nobody, right arrow, he chooses her publicly heroine framing. Ruined family daughter called nobody by society turned payoff. Chosen publicly / library declaration, the cruel humbled November wedding number span, none opening word, he notes. A1 last used entry 1, 10 prior. Fresh epithet, framing, opening word. # final scenes, closing the gap to target. # the letter Mrs. Morrow kept. I have mentioned the letter James wrote to Mrs. Morrow after the announcement, and I have given Mrs. Morrow's description of it as the most correct and careful and unexpectedly warm letter she had ever received. I want to try to convey what that meant, because in this context the word warm is doing considerable work, and the work it is doing is important to understand. James Sutherly was not, in his correspondence, cold. He was not the kind of man who writes with bureaucratic distance or who deploys the formal letter as a tool for maintaining appropriate spacing. He wrote with the same quality of precision that characterized everything he did. And precision, when it is applied to things that matter, produces its own kind of warmth. The warmth of being taken seriously, of having your specific situation addressed specifically, of receiving a communication that has clearly been thought about rather than assembled from available templates. But the warmth in the letter to Mrs. Morrow was of a different order. Mrs. Morrow told me. It was not the warmth of precision. It was the warmth of someone who had, in writing, allowed himself to be direct about what her daughter meant to him, in the kind of plain and unguarded language that directness produces when it is not being managed for social effect. He had written, Mrs. Morrow told me, about the card party. About the moment, though he did not say that he had been observing, he said simply that he had become aware of her that evening, when he had heard her answer Mrs. Galverton about her father. He had written that the answer had stayed with him, and that he had subsequently found a great many things about her daughter staying with him, and that this accumulation had produced a certainty that he did not intend to perform a way out of social caution or permit to be managed into ambiguity by the social world's preference for ambiguity in such matters. He had written that what he wished for Elspeth, above everything else, was that she should be in a situation worthy of her. That the situation the season had placed her in, which was not worthy of her, was something he intended to correct, not by managing the social landscape into a more hospitable configuration, but by creating a context in which the social landscape was simply no longer relevant. That the Harrowfield connection would not transform her into someone she was not. It would simply remove the requirement to maintain, at continuous cost, a position that should never have required maintenance. He had written, Mrs. Morrow said, that he liked her daughter. Not in the decorative sense, not in the qualifying sense, but in the direct sense. That he found her interesting and honest and specific, and that these qualities, in the specific form he had found them in her daughter, were what had produced the result they were now discussing. Mrs. Morrow said this letter was the thing, of all the things that happened that season and in the years following, that she returned to most often. Because it was specific. Because it was about Elspeth, the actual Elspeth in her actual specificness, and not about the position or the match or the social mathematics of the arrangement. Because it was honest, in the way that the letter writer was honest, and it told her clearly that her daughter was going to be seen, in this marriage, as what she actually was. Which is what every mother, I think, most hopes for her daughter. Not wealth, not position, not the admiration of a social world that has spent the preceding season declining to see her clearly. Simply, the seeing, the specific and accurate recognition of who the daughter actually is. The letter gave Mrs. Morrow this, and she kept it and has it still. The conversations we never quite had. There is a category of conversation that happens, in a long friendship, in the gaps between the conversations that are recorded. They happen in carriages, and in the moments before dinner guests arrive, and in the 10 minutes when both people are in a room and neither has yet decided what to say. They are not quite conversations. They are the ongoing background of understanding that builds up over years, and that constitutes, perhaps, the most important form of communication between people who have known each other for a very long time. James and I had many of these in the months of that season, and in the years following. I want to try to recover one or two of them, because they bear on the shape of the thing. There was a moment, I cannot date it precisely. I believe it was the week after the Ravenswood Park house party, before the formal announcement was made. When James and I were in my rooms after dinner, the fire had gone low, and neither of us was in any hurry to address this, and James said, without looking at me, "She will be all right." He was not asking whether she would be all right. He was not expressing concern. He was making a statement, in the specific declarative way of a man who has been considering a question for a long time and has arrived at an answer he is sufficiently confident in to voice. "Yes," I said. "I have been uncertain about this," he said. "Not about what I intend, but about whether what I intend will be sufficient. Whether the position will absorb her, in the way that positions can absorb people." I understood what he meant. The Harrowfield dukedom was a large machine, and large machines have a tendency to process the people who enter them according to the machine's requirements rather than the person's character. The Duchess of Harrowfield was expected to be a specific kind of person, to perform a specific set of functions, to occupy a specific kind of role, to present a specific social face. James was worried, I understood, that this requirement might not destroy her. That was too dramatic, but file away at the specific qualities that had produced her, in the way that a file can reduce a distinctive shape to a smooth and generic one. "She won't allow it," I said. "No," he said after a moment, "I don't think she will." "She manages things that are more difficult than Harrowfield," I said. "She managed the season. She managed the machinery of the season's assessment daily for 6 months, and she came out of it exactly herself. The machinery of a ducal estate is not going to do what the machinery of the London season could not do." He was quiet. Then, "That is the specific thought that gives me confidence," he said, "that she has already demonstrated under considerable pressure that she remains herself." "Yes," I said, "she has." Another quiet interval. Then, very quietly, something I had not heard him say before, and have not heard him say since in quite that way. "I find I care very much about this." He did not specify what he meant by *this. He did not need to. What he meant was that she should be all right, that she should remain herself, that the thing he had found in the card party and the watercolor exhibition and the library and the stone bench by the lake should not be ground away by the requirements of the position or the social world or anything else. He cared about this in the way that people care about specific things, not about categories. I knew this, and he knew that I knew this, and neither of us needed to say so, and that was the conversation. The nature of the choosing, one more time. I have said that he chose her. I want to be exact about what this means, because choosing is used as a word in so many senses that its meaning becomes vague with use. He chose her in the sense that every choice he made that season, the Cotman, the dance at Almack's, the Thursday dinners, the study of Shropshire geology, the promissory note that traveled with him, was a choice in her direction. Not a single dramatic decision, but a series of smaller ones, each of which was freely made, and could have been made otherwise, and was made the way it was made because it was the accurate thing, the honest thing, the thing consistent with what he had observed and what he had concluded from the observation. He chose her in the sense that when Lady Alverston said, "The Morrow girl," he said Miss Morrow, a choice so small as to be invisible to anyone not paying attention, and so significant that its significance is still visible to me 30 years later. He chose her in the sense that he stood in front of Miss Denborough's group and said, "I hope I was mistaken," which was a public choice, made at some social cost, with the room watching. He chose her in the sense that he said Elspeth in the library at Ravenswood Park, and laid on the table what he had to lay on the table, and waited. The choosing, in other words, was not an event, it was a practice. A daily practice, over the course of several months, of refusing to accept the inaccurate version of her that the social world was offering, and offering instead, at each available moment, the accurate version. This is what choosing looks like when it is actually happening, as opposed to the moment of drama that stories generally identify as the choosing. The moment of drama is there. The library at Ravenswood is the library at Ravenswood, and it cannot be reduced to merely the articulation of an ongoing practice. But what made the library possible was the practice. The practice is what made the library real rather than performative. And she chose him in the same way, not in a single dramatic moment but in a series of smaller ones, each of which could have gone otherwise and went the way it went because she was looking clearly and concluding honestly. She chose him when she answered the question about whether she was playing the cards or the people, and leaned in slightly toward the answer rather than away from it. She chose him when she allowed the promissory note situation to resolve the way it resolved. She chose him when she gave the satisfactory answer at the Half Moon Street drawing-room call. She chose him when she accepted the waltz at Almack's, understanding what accepting meant. These were all choices. They were all made freely. They could all have been made otherwise. They were made in the direction they were made, because she was looking honestly at what she was looking at and concluding honestly from what she saw. Yes, though my posture will still straighten. That was the last choice. The culminating choice, the choice that contained all the others within it, the choice made with complete awareness of what it meant and complete freedom in the making of it. That was the choosing. And the choosing, having been done, was irrevocable in the way that all genuine choices are irrevocable. Not because it could not be unmade, but because it changed the world the person was in, so that the world before the choice and the world after it were different worlds. After the library, they were in a different world. They had been building it, choice by choice, since Mrs. Galverton's card party, but the library was when it became real. When the world contained both of them in it, choosing each other, in the specific way that real things are real and performative things are not. This is what I watched happen over the course of the season of 1843. And it was, and remains, the most real thing I have ever watched happen. Complete end.